Just as I raised my glass to make a toast at my son's wedding, his father-in-law, Harold Hart, pointed straight at me in front of 200 guests and said loudly, "You are not worthy of being part of my family. Your son is nothing but a parasite." The ballroom fell silent, followed by a few awkward, uncomfortable laughs. I froze where I stood, my hand shaking so much that wine spilled down my dress. But while Harold thought I was weak, he had no idea I was holding something that could destroy his entire life, something I had kept in my purse for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And tonight was that moment. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I, Marjorie Lane, 67 years old, believed I had lived long enough not to tremble at anyone's cruelty anymore. But when Harold Hart said those words, under the bright gold lights of the Hilton Hotel ballroom and with 200 eyes fixed on me, my heart tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. My whole life I tried to raise Nathan to be a decent man, respectful, hard-working, building himself from nothing. We were not wealthy, but we were honest. And Harold, with his expensive tuxedo, smug smile, and eyes full of contempt, crushed all of that with a single sentence. I heard silverware stop clinking. A few guests forced awkward smiles to cover their embarrassment. An older woman at the table near mine let out a long sigh, as if witnessing something that should never happen at such a sacred ceremony. But I stayed frozen, feeling only the cold wine seeping into the navy satin dress I was wearing. At that moment, what hurt the most wasn't Harold's words. It was my son's eyes. Nathan stood a few tables away, his face pale, his lips barely moving. "Mom." But before he could come to me, Alyssa, my future daughter-in-law, gripped his hand tightly and shook her head, signaling him to stay silent. His eyes held no anger toward me, only despair. Despair because he was trapped between the two people he loved most and couldn't protect either of us. I looked at Alyssa. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. Clearly, she hadn't expected her father to behave like that, but her fear wasn't strong enough for her to stand up against him. And Nathan, I knew he would stay silent because he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Harold kept talking, his voice steady and sharp like a formal accusation. The Hart family has always been made of accomplished, educated people with solid backgrounds. And I want to say this in front of everyone. I hope my daughter is strong enough to lead a man who is still struggling to find his place in society. Find his place in society, he emphasized each word as if hammering it into my son's dignity. I heard a few small laughs, the nasty approval of people who judge worth by money and reputation. I brushed the wine off my dress and lifted my head to look Harold straight in the eye. I smiled, just a small smile, but enough to make him pause for half a second. Just a flicker, but I caught the discomfort in his eyes. Perhaps he thought I would run off, cry, or ruin the wedding, but I didn't. I just stood there smiling as if I were waiting for him to finish, because I truly was waiting for him to step right into the trap I had laid, not with lies, but with the truth, a truth sharp enough to slice through the armor of reputation he'd worn for years. I tightened my grip on my purse. Inside were envelopes filled with documents, photos, statements, evidence I never wanted to possess, yet had no choice but to keep. Evidence I discovered months ago, starting with a small coincidence that, looking back, I now believe was destiny. Everything began on an April afternoon when I visited Harold and Sharon's home to discuss wedding plans. I arrived earlier than expected, and while I was still near the entrance, I heard Harold's voice coming from his office. His tone was loud, tense, stripped of his usual polished manners. "You need to hide that money. I won't let anyone on the board find out about this. You understand?" I froze, my hand resting lightly on the wooden door frame. I thought I misheard, but then Harold continued, his voice lower but threatening. "And let me be clear. If this gets out, not only will I fall, the entire company will collapse." I stepped back, my heartbeat suddenly fast and uneven. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew it wasn't something innocent, and it definitely wasn't something a respectable man like Harold wanted anyone to overhear. When he walked out, I was already in the living room pretending to admire a painting. Harold's face shifted instantly when he saw me. Then he gave me a smile, the same one I'd seen 100 times, overly confident and perfect to the point of being fake. "Oh, Marjorie, you're early," I replied casually, but inside I knew something was wrong. After that day, the uneasy feeling followed me like a shadow. I paid more attention, I observed more closely, and the more I looked, the more the scattered pieces began to fit into something very dangerous. Sharon always dodged questions about her husband's work. Alyssa avoided talking about their family finances, and Harold constantly bragged about Hart and Sons as if it were an impenetrable fortress. But every fortress has cracks. And I, an old mother with nothing but persistence, decided to find them. I went to see Caleb Morton, a private investigator and former cop in Scottsdale. I had hired him 10 years ago for a family matter, and I knew he never did sloppy work. I still remember the look he gave me when I explained the situation. "You want to investigate your future daughter-in-law's father. I want the truth," I said. "That's all I want." Caleb sat quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's begin." I never expected that, just a few weeks. Later, Caleb would return with information that kept me awake for many nights. Nights when I lay in my small home, staring at the ceiling like I was staring into a bottomless void. A void where Harold Hart's reputation, wealth, and entire glittering life were collapsing. And I knew. I would have to unveil that truth at the right moment. Not to get revenge, but to save my son from a life of humiliation. The same humiliation I had just endured under the ballroom lights of his own wedding. Today, tonight, this moment was where it all began. I always thought of myself as easygoing, not picky, with my son's relationships. Nathan was grown, had a stable job, and could choose for himself. But from the moment he brought Alyssa home for dinner, something inside me shifted. Not because I disliked her. Alyssa was beautiful, soft-spoken, and polite, but because her presence changed the air in my home. Something was too perfect, too shiny, too calculated. That evening, Nathan brought Alyssa over. I made pot roast and toasted bread, his childhood favorites. When I opened the door, Alyssa stood there with a bright smile, holding a bouquet of pale pink tulips, wearing a stylish dress and just enough jewelry to draw attention without overdoing it. "Nathan said you love flowers," she said as she handed me the tulips. I accepted them with thanks, but my eyes quickly dropped to her shoes. Expensive designer heels. There's nothing wrong with dressing well, but with Alyssa, everything felt intentional, crafted. Nathan didn't notice at all. He looked at her with bright, excited eyes. The eyes of a man tasting happiness for the first time. I understood. I had once seen that same look in his father, but I also knew that same glow can blind someone to danger. During dinner, Alyssa was sweet, asking about my hobbies, complimenting my kitchen, praising the house decor. but several times when I spoke, she smiled, a polite smile. Yet I had the sense she wasn't really listening. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was too protective of my son. But the feeling grew stronger the night Nathan invited me to dinner at Alyssa's parents' home. The Hart mansion was so large that I felt lost the moment we stepped inside. The front door stood nearly 10 feet tall, the yard perfectly manicured, the floor marble cold beneath my feet. The entryway alone looked like a museum lobby. Harold and Sharon waited at the top of the staircase. Harold in an immaculate suit, grinning wide enough to show every tooth. Sharon in a soft blue dress, smiled gently but avoided my eyes. "Welcome to our home," Harold said, spreading his arms like an MC on stage. Nathan was impressed. Alyssa wrapped her arm around his and smiled, a smile that tightened something in my chest. Dinner was filled with Harold's subtle bragging. He spoke about buying half the mansion in cash, expanding Hart & Sons, his investment portfolio, tax strategies. As if Nathan were sitting through a corporate seminar. Sharon quietly nodded. I listened, silent. At one point, Harold leaned toward me and said, "You know, my family has always protected its reputation. We cannot afford any cracks." He emphasized, "Absolutely cannot." I gave a polite smile, but inside I felt a cold ripple. People terrified of losing reputation usually have something big to hide. Sharon never once met my eyes that night. Alyssa rarely looked comfortable when family finances came up, and the expensive items around the house looked unused, too new. Everything felt like a stage set. As dinner ended, Harold lifted his glass. "My family has protected our name for generations. I hope this marriage does not disappoint us." I heard it loud and clear, a warning, and in that moment I knew the Hart family was not perfect. They only tried to look perfect, and that kind of perfection always hides something. I left that night with a certainty. Something was very wrong, and if I didn't uncover it soon, my son would be the one paying the price. Dinner with both families, the official meeting, was scheduled a few weeks later. Nathan was excited, convinced this was a step toward unity. I didn't want to dampen his joy, so I agreed, though my heart felt heavier with every passing day. The dinner was hosted at an upscale Italian restaurant, the kind Harold described as worthy of discussing the future. Nathan and I arrived first. I wore a beige sweater with an old blazer that had belonged to my late husband. Nathan complimented me, telling me not to worry, but the moment we stepped inside, my heartbeat quickened. Harold and Sharon arrived next, followed by Alyssa in a red dress that drew every eye in the room. Harold shook Nathan's hand, then shook mine with his typical performative smile. "Well, you look better tonight than the last time," he said, as if it were a compliment, but his tone sounded more like a judgment. I smiled politely. Refusing to react was the only way not to turn this dinner into a battlefield. As we sat down, Harold ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu without even glancing at the price. He told us about his busy day, board meetings, a new project inspection, contract negotiations. I noticed the way he talked about his work, as if the entire world revolved around him alone. Nathan sat up straight, trying to look mature and worthy, but I sensed the tension in his eyes. He knew tonight was going to be a test, and Harold was the examiner. He didn't wait long. The appetizers had barely been served when Harold leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and stared straight at Nathan. "So, Nathan, I want to know your income." No sugarcoating, no warm-up, just a bare, wallet-stripping question. Nathan froze. Alyssa turned to her father and said softly, Dad, not now. Harold raised his hand to silence her. I have the right to know. My daughter is about to marry him. I need to know whether he can provide the life she deserves. We'll build everything together, Nathan said, his voice small but firm. Harold laughed. Build? You're renting a place. Your income barely covers your rent. What kind of life can you give Alyssa? The room seemed to dim a little. I saw my son lower his head, his hands clasped together, just like when he was a child, every time he got a bad grade and was afraid I'd be disappointed. Alyssa sat beside him, staring down at her plate, lips pressed tightly together. She didn't defend Nathan, not one word, not even a gentle squeeze of his hand. My chest burned, not from shame, but from love for my child. I rested my hand lightly on Nathan's, then turned to Harold. I don't think Nathan's job is the most important thing. What matters is that they love each other and respect each other, I said, keeping my voice calm. Harold raised an eyebrow. Respect? May I be honest, Marjorie? You sound a little, idealistic. I smiled just as lightly as he had mocked me. And you sound a little, harsh. Harold let out a laugh, one with no warmth at all. Being harsh means being realistic. Alyssa was raised in a different environment. I don't want her to suffer. I replied, who said loving Nathan means suffering? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Many people don't realize they're suffering until it's too late. I'm just protecting my daughter. I stayed silent, but inside, everything felt like it was spinning. I was not used to being looked down on by anyone. But what hurt more was watching this man crush my son just to prove he was more powerful. I suddenly remembered what he said at the mansion. My family's reputation cannot afford a single crack. Tonight he was using that reputation to humiliate others, a reputation I was beginning to suspect wasn't real. Nathan tried to salvage the dinner by talking about his job and the projects he was working on, but Harold only nodded indifferently, occasionally hurling sharp questions like tiny needles. Do you plan to buy a house? How much savings do you have? Do you think you have the backbone to protect a family? Nathan answered each question quietly, but I could feel the deep hurt behind every word. Alyssa stayed silent, completely silent. She didn't comfort Nathan, didn't defend him. She looked frozen, or worse, afraid to go against her father. Dinner dragged on awkwardly. I kept my face composed, but my heart broke a little every time I looked at Nathan. When the main course was served, Harold continued, You say you love Alyssa, but love isn't enough, Nathan. Not enough. I set my utensils down. Mr. Hart, I said, my voice so steady even I was surprised. I understand your worry for your daughter. We all worry for our children, but my son is a decent man, and decency is valuable. Harold smirked. Decency doesn't buy a good life. I looked straight into his eyes, but it helps people live a better one. He went silent for a second. Then he let out a half laugh, half sneer. I hope you truly believe that. I didn't respond because at that moment I understood exactly what kind of man Harold was. Someone who stepped on others so he could see himself as taller. He saw Nathan as a temporary choice, as if my son wasn't worthy of climbing the golden staircase he built around his family. When dinner ended, Nathan walked Alyssa to her car. I stayed behind to get my coat. Harold approached me, keeping just enough distance to avoid seeming impolite. I didn't say those things to insult you, he said quietly. I said them as a warning. Your son is not worthy of my daughter. I looked at him for a long time. I wanted to say something sharp, something fierce, but in the end I simply said, "You underestimate people too easily, Harold." He shrugged. "Or you overestimate them." I turned away, but in that moment something cold and determined slid through me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. That night when Nathan drove me home, he spoke very little. I knew he was ashamed, hurt, feeling small under that man's judgment. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, afraid of hurting him more. "You don't need to prove anything to him," I said. "You just need to live true to yourself." Nathan nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully hear me. He hadn't lost to Harold tonight. He had lost to his own fear. When he drove away, I stood on the porch watching the taillights disappear, and I whispered, "You are not walking into a marriage of humiliation. I promise you that." But promises weren't enough. I needed truth. I needed proof of who Harold really was. I needed something Nathan couldn't ignore. From that night on, I wrote down every expression, every comment, every glance Harold made. Every small detail could become a puzzle piece, and the more I recorded, the more cracks I saw in the perfect, wealthy story he had built. What I didn't know yet was that those cracks would lead to a massive secret, one that would tear the Hart family apart on the very day they thought their power was untouchable. In the days after that disastrous dinner, a dull feeling pulsed inside me like a tiny needle pressing into the palm, light but persistent, impossible to ignore. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, not wanting to add pressure, but the image of Harold, his cold eyes, his cutting words, replayed endlessly. A man like that could not be as flawless as the mask he wore. And then, one Friday afternoon, as I parked near the North Scottsdale shopping center to buy baking supplies, I happened to see something I still believe fate placed in front of me. Harold's glossy black SUV was parked in a far corner of the lot, where few cars passed. I recognized the license plate immediately. I'd seen it enough times at the Hart mansion. At first, I thought he was just shopping. But when he stepped out, something was off. He no longer wore his usual smug expression. He kept looking around nervously, as if afraid someone was watching. I leaned slightly in my seat, staying hidden. A minute later, a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, walked toward him. She was naturally beautiful, simply dressed. Beside her were two children, a boy around 8 and a girl around 6, and both children called Harold Dad. I felt my heart drop to the floor of the car. The little girl ran to him, hugging his leg. Harold bent down, stroked her hair with the same hand that had once shaken mine with arrogance. The young woman smiled anxiously and said something quietly. Harold pressed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. They exchanged hushed words, their eyes darting around. Just watching them, I knew they weren't distant relatives. I didn't have experience with other people's family drama, but I had lived long enough to recognize what I was looking at. This was not a coincidence. This was a family. When Harold turned and accidentally spotted me, his face drained of color. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He shoved the children into the SUV, almost too quickly, urged the woman into the front seat, and within seconds the car peeled away, tires almost lifting dust off the pavement. I stood still for a long time, chest tight with anger. How rotten could a man be? How far could someone go with lies just to look respectable? When I finally entered the store, my hands still trembled. That evening, I called Alyssa. I didn't want to confront her. Not yet, but I wanted to hear her reaction. She sounded cheerful at first, but when I casually mentioned Harold and asked what he'd been doing that afternoon, she fell silent. Oh, he must have seen, a cousin. Alyssa said, her voice shaking so noticeably I heard it even through the phone. One of his cousins just came back to town. I closed my eyes. The first lie someone tells when they're cornered is always the worst. I didn't push her. I thanked her and ended the call. But from that moment on, I knew I had stepped into a secret too big for their family to hide behind silence. That night, I opened my late husband's old notebook, the one he used for work, and wrote, day, month, year. Harold Hart has a second family. The next morning, I went to private investigator Caleb Morton's office. Caleb was in his mid-50s, solid build, weathered face, sharp but kind eyes. He had helped me once in a land dispute years ago. He wasn't a man of unnecessary words. When I told him everything, Caleb crossed his arms and listened without interrupting. He only raised his eyebrows when I mentioned the two children calling Harold Dad. I need the truth, I said, fingers entwined, not to destroy Alyssa's life, but to save my son before he gets pulled into a family built on lies. Caleb nodded. I understand. But I want everything to be legal, clear. I want proof, and I want it fast, before the wedding. He opened his notebook and jotted down a few lines. I'll tail him for 2 weeks. His schedule, where he goes, who he meets. If there's something off, you'll know. I exhaled, part of a heavy weight lifting from my chest. Caleb never made empty promises. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 months. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, cooking for him, chatting about his work, and I avoided mentioning Alyssa or the Harts. But when he left the house, I would sit by the window, watching the street, a quiet fire burning in me. Harold remained perfect on social media. Sharon kept posting elegant dinners. Alyssa kept smiling every time Nathan brought her to visit. But now, I saw the truth behind the pictures. Some secrets are so big that people must perform a lifelong play to hide them. On day 12, Caleb called. Mrs. Lane, he said, his voice low, I think you should come to the office. I knew that tone. It wasn't good news. When I arrived, Caleb placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were photos of Harold with the woman I had seen, and with the 2 children, photos of them at the park, eating dinner, walking the kids to school. Not acquaintances, a real family. Caleb flipped to another page. Bank transfers, purchases, tuition payments, all funded from an account tied to Hart & Sons. He's had a second family for 8 years, Caleb said, and he's supporting them entirely with company money. My breath hitched. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Caleb continued. There are unexplained withdrawals from several construction projects. I can't confirm the full legal implications yet, but... He pushed the financial report toward me. The gaps are huge. I opened each page, my hands trembling slightly. The numbers, the shady line items, the strange notes. They all came together into one clear picture. Harold wasn't just deceiving his wife and children. He was deceiving the company, the shareholders, and everyone who believed he was an honest businessman. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the small office spin around me. Are you all right? Caleb asked. I took a deep breath. I'm all right. I was prepared for this. It just still hurts a little. Caleb nodded. I closed the file. Looking at it on the table felt like staring at a fire ant nest. Touch it once, and the whole swarm would come pouring out and tear everything apart. I knew from that moment on, I had stepped into a battle far bigger than anything I ever imagined. But I also knew something else, more clearly than ever. I would not let my son walk into a marriage tied to a family built on lies. Caleb's file sat in front of me the entire evening like a stone pressing against my chest. I read every page, every number, every little scribble he had marked in red. Each line was a blade slicing into the perfect image Harold always tried to present, the same image my son was preparing to step into with blind trust. I had thought Harold having a second family was the lowest form of betrayal. But when Caleb expanded his investigation, I realized I had only seen the tip of a massive iceberg. The next morning, I went back to Caleb's office. As soon as he saw me, he stood, opened a drawer, and took out another thicker stack of documents. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice low and heavy, "I'm afraid things are even worse than we expected." I tightened my grip on my purse, my heart pounding. How bad? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He handed me a financial statement covered in numbers. Hart & Sons has hidden debts in the tens of millions of dollars. I almost couldn't believe my ears. But Harold said his company was growing. "That's exactly the problem," Caleb cut in. He lied, or more precisely, he's been surviving on layers of forged documents, fake contracts, and highly sophisticated financial manipulation. My legs lost strength as I sank into the chair. Caleb opened page after page. Project accounts drained with no explanation. Funds transferred to a shell company under the young woman's name. The remaining money funneled into high-risk investments to make up the losses, which failed miserably. "Where did he get the money?" I asked, though the answer was already crystal clear. Caleb looked at me with sad eyes. "From the low-income housing project, a large portion was siphoned off to support the second family." I inhaled sharply, not from shock, but from pure outrage. I wasn't someone who cried easily, but knowing poor families lost their homes because Harold wanted to live two lives, it hurt in a different way. "What did he do to the project?" I asked. Caleb placed a set of photos in front of me. Unfinished buildings, cracked brick walls, incomplete roofs, pipes propped up temporarily. "They reported 100 completed units," Caleb said. "In reality, they've built fewer than 40, and the quality is terrible." My hands trembled as I turned to the next page. "Fake documents," Caleb continued. "Inflated material costs, contractor swaps for kickbacks. Some workers haven't been paid for months. I met 3 of them. All said Harold threatened to sue them if they spoke up." I leaned back, holding my head with both hands. Each detail was a hammer blow, heavier than the last. "Has anyone tried to sue?" I asked. "Yes," Caleb replied, "but they were intimidated. Harold has cousins in major banks and friends on the city council. He knows exactly who to use to keep mouths shut." I stayed silent. A man with 2 families was bad enough, but a man who stole millions of dollars from housing for the poor, withheld wages from workers, and threatened victims, that was beyond betrayal. That was a crime. Caleb placed one hand gently on the table. "I know what you're thinking." I looked up. "Do you?" He nodded. "You're wondering if you should expose him. You're thinking about Nathan and Alyssa, too." I bit my lip. "Alyssa doesn't know about this, does she?" "I don't believe she knows everything. Maybe a little, but certainly not the full scale." I closed my eyes. Alyssa's face flashed in my mind. The way she sat silent while Nathan was humiliated at dinner, the shaky lie about cousins, her inability to stand up to Harold even once. I didn't hate Alyssa, but I wasn't naive enough to believe she was strong enough to survive the storm that would follow. If this exploded, she would be the first to be swept away. Caleb said, "You should understand, if you bring him down, it won't just be a scandal. It'll blow up across the entire city." I opened my eyes. I don't want revenge, Caleb. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to save my son before he ties his life to a family built on lies. If they marry, Nathan will sink with him. Caleb studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then what you need is timing. I asked softly, what timing? The moment when the truth destroys him the most? The moment when the whole world is watching him? I understood immediately. The wedding. The day Harold Hart wanted to flaunt his reputation, his family, his power. The day he believed everything was his. Respect, admiration, control. If the truth came out on that day, it wouldn't just crack his mask. He would destroy himself in front of everyone he sought to impress. I stood, thanked Caleb, and held the file to my chest like a ticking bomb. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in the old chair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in when he read the newspaper, and watched the streetlights reflect on the grass outside. The cool Arizona night air slipped through the window crack, but I still felt warm. I thought about Nathan, about how he lowered his head before Harold at dinner, about how he wanted to be stronger so he could deserve Alyssa, about the future he was chasing, a future he didn't know was built on deception. I touched the edge of the file. So many numbers, so much evidence, so many voices, enough to destroy Harold and save my son. But I also knew, once I took this step, there would be no turning back. The next day, when Nathan stopped by to grab his suit for a fitting, he wore a smile I hadn't seen since the dinner with the in-laws. "Mom, things are getting better," he said. "Harold, well, Alyssa's dad, seems to be trying to accept me." I looked into his eyes, those hopeful eyes too pure to see what I had seen. "Nathan," I asked softly, "are you truly happy?" He smiled. "I have Alyssa. That's enough." I didn't say another word. I couldn't. If I spoke, I would have had to tell him everything, and the time for that hadn't come. When he drove away, I pressed a hand to my chest and whispered, "My son, I will protect you, even if it means shattering that man's perfect facade." I looked at the file one last time before closing it. That night, I understood one thing clearly. If I wanted to save Nathan, I had to let Harold collapse under the weight of his own secrets. And the wedding would be the place where he would bow before the truth. After that tense dinner with the in-laws, I could feel Nathan slowly drifting away from me. Not because he wanted to, but because something thin and fog-like had formed between us. Something Alyssa had woven so softly that Nathan couldn't feel it, but I could see it clearly. Nathan still visited me every week, but instead of stepping inside with his usual warm smile, he now lingered at the doorway, as if weighing something before speaking. His words began to change, sharper, more sensitive, and sometimes hurtful in a way I never imagined he could be. One afternoon, when he came by to pick up a jacket I had washed, his face looked more strained than usual. I invited him in, but he stood in the middle of the living room, hands in his pockets, staring at the carpet as if the words he carried were too heavy. "Mom," he began, quiet but firm, "Alyssa said, 'You're not happy about her family.'" I set my teacup down. I had braced myself for this conversation, but when it actually arrived, my chest tightened. "Son," I said gently, "I just want you to be happy." Nathan sighed, then lifted his eyes to mine. "Alyssa said you're jealous." My heart sank, not because of the accusation, but because Nathan believed it enough to repeat it. "Jealous of what?" I asked calmly. "Jealous that her family is wealthier, that they have more." He paused, then added, Alyssa said you don't like her because she comes from a better background. I let out a faint laugh, not of amusement, but of disbelief that such an idea could exist. Nathan, I said, I've lived long enough to know what's worth envying and what isn't. A wealthy family isn't on my list. But Nathan shook his head, as if my words couldn't reach him. Then why do you always get upset when Harold is mentioned? He asked. I wanted to say, because Harold is a liar, a betrayer, and a dangerous man. I wanted to open the safe, pull out every document and photo Caleb had collected, but I couldn't. Not then. Not before the right moment. Because I'm afraid someone will hurt you, I said instead. Nathan looked at me. For a brief second, tenderness flickered in his eyes, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by the unfamiliar coldness I had been seeing lately. Alyssa said you don't respect her dad, he continued. She said you look down on his success. I stayed silent. And isn't that true? Nathan's voice trembled slightly. Maybe he didn't want to say it, but he did. I didn't feel angry, just deeply hurt, the kind of hurt that sinks through bone. When your child begins to see you through someone else's eyes, you finally understand what it means to lose a child without anyone stealing them from you. I stood, placed my hand on Nathan's shoulder. Son, I said slowly, I don't look down on anyone, but I have eyes. I see things you don't yet see. I just want you to think carefully about this marriage. He gently brushed my hand off his shoulder instinctively. Mom, can't you just accept Alyssa? I swallowed the ache in my throat. I can accept anyone who makes you happy, I said, as long as they treat you well, as long as their family doesn't make you feel small. Nathan frowned. That's your view, Mom, not mine. I didn't respond, because I knew the more I spoke, the more he would think I was against Alyssa. And that was the last thing I wanted before the truth came out. When Nathan left, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street. I placed a hand over my heart, feeling it race with fear. Fear of losing him. Fear that the truth would come too late. Fear that he saw me as controlling or selfish. Fear that he would marry into an illusion and one day pay for it with his whole life. Sometimes motherhood isn't pulling your child into your arms. It's watching them walk toward a mistake and waiting for the exact moment to pull them back before they fall off a cliff. That night, I went into my bedroom, opened the closet, and took out the small safe I kept under the spare blanket. I placed it on the bed and slowly unlocked it. Inside were the 3 brown envelopes I had been preparing for days. One envelope had Nathan's name on it. One envelope had Alyssa's name. One envelope had Sharon Hart's. Each envelope was thick with papers, photos, financial records, and construction reports Caleb had quietly collected. I had printed every document, labeled each page clearly. Everything inside was the truth. The truth Harold had been hiding behind layers of power and money. I touched the envelope with my son's name a little longer. Inside, it was everything he needed to know so he wouldn't be buried under the rubble Harold was building with his dirty hands. I wanted to tell him right away, but I knew if I gave him this envelope too early, he would think I was trying to ruin the wedding. If I gave it too late, his life could be crushed. The right timing. That was what Caleb reminded me. The right timing. That was what I repeated to myself every day. A few days later, Alyssa texted me, I hope you understand I never meant to make Nathan drift away from you. I stared at that sentence and felt my heart turn cold, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Alyssa didn't want a war, but she wanted Nathan to belong to her family, entirely, without ties. And Harold wanted that too. That was when I understood the real meaning of the fear of losing a child. It's not someone ripping your child from your arms. It's when they make your child believe another embrace is softer, safer. I folded my phone shut and breathed deeply. I couldn't blame Alyssa completely. She grew up in a world where family prestige mattered more than truth. Love was often defined by how well you obeyed. And Harold, he had taught her that. And Nathan? He loved. He was blind. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be a good man in Alyssa's eyes. But to do that, he was unknowingly drifting further and further away from me. I reminded myself, wait, Marjorie, wait for the right moment. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I opened the safe again. I took out the 3 envelopes and checked them one last time. Photos of Harold holding the 2 children. Video of Harold transferring money into the shell company account. Fake financial reports. The list of underpaid workers. Photos of the unfinished low-income units that were reported as completed. I organized everything neatly and put it back into the safe. I knew. One day soon, Harold would have to face all of this in front of his own family, and no one would be able to save him from the truth. I closed the safe, pushed it deep under the closet shelf, and covered it with a blanket. I turned off the light and walked into the living room, where the glow from the street lamp stretched my shadow across the floor. I looked at that shadow and whispered, "The wedding won't be peaceful, Harold Hart, and I'll be there. I won't let my son be buried under your fake reputation." I sat down on the chair, stretched my arms, and exhaled slowly. Outside, the night wind rustled through the old oak trees in the yard. It was a quiet evening, but inside me, a storm waited for its hour to rise. I prepared myself for everything, for the collapse, for the tears, for the anger, for the panic, for even the bitter laugh Harold wouldn't be able to force out once his mask fell. I wasn't seeking victory. I wasn't seeking revenge. I only wanted one thing, to save my son, before it was too late. Nathan visited me on the afternoon before the wedding. I had just put a batch of pastries in the oven when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was my son's smile, a smile so wide it felt like it lit up the hallway. Nathan wore a white shirt, khaki pants, his hair neatly trimmed, and his eyes glowing with a pure happiness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Mom," Nathan said, opening his arms and hugging me, "tomorrow will be the best day of my life." I hugged him back, but my hands trembled. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "I'm happy for you, Nathan." But my heart felt squeezed tight, because I knew what Nathan didn't. I knew the truth, the kind of truth that would break him if he learned it tonight. Nathan walked into the kitchen, sat down, and took a deep breath as if he needed courage to say something. "Mom," he said, "I want you to really be happy for me. I want tomorrow to be perfect." I opened the oven and set the tray of pastries on the counter to cool. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled the kitchen. The scent of his childhood, of Christmas mornings, of school days when I woke early to bake for him. "I always want you to be whole," I said. "But son, marriage isn't just love. It's family, and you should think carefully about the family you're walking into." I didn't say it to ruin his wedding. I said it because I was his mother. I said it because my heart hurt too much not to. Nathan leaned back in his chair, hands rubbing his temples. "Mom, you're starting again," he muttered, "again with the Hart family." I turned around and looked right into his eyes. The eyes I once wiped tears from, the eyes I watched grow up, the eyes that lit up when he achieved his first dream. "I'm not starting anything," I said softly. "I'm worried." Nathan shook his head, giving a small, strained smile. Not the warm one he arrived with. "What is there to worry about, Mom? I love Alyssa. She loves me. Her family might be a little strict, but that doesn't matter." I asked the question I had carried in my heart for months. "Are you sure they see you as part of their family?" Nathan looked up, his expression briefly annoyed. "You're prejudiced against them." I stood still. I didn't want to argue, not tonight. But that sentence pierced me, not because it was harsh, but because it carried the tone of Harold, and that frightened me more than any of the financial evidence Caleb had uncovered. I walked closer and placed a hand on my son's shoulder. "Nathan," I said slowly, "I'm not prejudiced. I have experience. I have eyes, and I see what you don't yet see." He looked away. When he looked back, there was a layer of defensiveness in his gaze I had never seen before. "You don't know them the way I do," he said. "I spend more time with them than you. They're not as bad as you think. You're just worrying too much." I didn't argue. I didn't say Harold was a liar. I didn't say Heart and Sons was drowning in debt. I didn't say Alyssa was being manipulated by her own father. I didn't say anything I knew, because if I did, tonight would destroy Nathan, not Harold. I simply looked at my son for a long time, so long that he lowered his head slightly, as if he could feel the sadness in my eyes. "Mom," he whispered, I love you, but I also have to live my own life." I nodded. "And I want you to live that life in real happiness, not inside a glossy wrapper someone else created." He sighed again, a long sigh that felt like every cell in his body was being stretched thin. "Tomorrow, just come, okay?" he said. "I want you there." I placed my hand on his cheek. "No matter what happens, I'll always be there. Always." Nathan smiled, a smile that made my heart ache and warm at the same time. Then he left, saying he needed to go help Alyssa with the rehearsal. When the door closed, the house fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes your chest shake. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, both hands over my heart, trying to breathe. Tonight, I knew I wouldn't sleep. When the streetlights flicked on, I opened the safe again. The 3 envelopes lay there. 3 truths that would change the fate of the entire Hart family. I placed them on the dining table, turned on the lamp, and began checking each envelope. In Nathan's envelope, photos of Harold holding the 2 children, bank statements showing he funded them with company money, video of him meeting the young woman in the parking lot, reports of the unfinished housing project. In Alyssa's envelope, the truth about the father she idolized, written more gently, with a note telling her she wasn't at fault, but she needed to know who she was defending. In Sharon's envelope, financial documents, proof Harold created a private fund under another woman's name, statements showing he withdrew money from their joint account. I added a few small notes to each file. Short explanations, easy to understand, so no one could misinterpret anything. I made sure everything was clear, organized, and factual. By the time I finished, the clock struck 11 at night. The lamp cast a warm glow on the pages, making them look almost golden, not because of the light, but because of the weight of the truth inside them. I remembered Caleb's words. To make him expose himself, you need a big stage. And tomorrow, I would have a ballroom of 200 people. Tomorrow, Harold would think he was at the peak of his reputation. Tomorrow, The entire city would be watching the Hart family, and tomorrow the mask he had worn for years would fall. I gathered the envelopes and placed them carefully into my purse. I touched the purse, thinking about how it now carried the fate of so many people, Nathan, Alyssa, and even Sharon. I turned off the lamp, letting the kitchen sink into the gentle darkness of the Arizona night. When I stepped into the living room, I paused at the window, looking at the sky sprinkled with tiny stars. I whispered, almost to myself, "Tomorrow, son, I'll protect you, and no one will stop me." I stood there a little longer, letting my fear and determination blend together. Tomorrow was the wedding, but for me, tomorrow would be a battle. The wedding took place under the bright golden Arizona sun, the kind of sunlight people get used to here, but today it felt harsher than ever. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed time to breathe and steady myself before facing a family teetering on the edge of a cliff they didn't know they were standing on. The hotel ballroom was decorated beautifully. Crisp white tablecloths, flickering candles, rows of pure white lilies lining the tables. Everything was perfect. Perfect in the exact way Harold always imagined. I sat at my assigned seat at the third table, not too far from the stage, but not close enough to be the center of anything. Nathan appeared soon after, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a navy tie I had given him months ago. His face glowed with excitement, though a hint of nerves lingered. When our eyes met, he smiled. That gentle, honest smile I adored. Good, I thought. My son deserves happiness, but not the kind built on lies. The ceremony passed gently, warmly, almost making me forget everything I had prepared. But that moment didn't last. After Nathan and Alyssa exchanged vows, the wedding music soared through the applause. I tried to stay calm, but my hand quietly gripped the edge of the table. Then came the toasts, the part Harold had rehearsed as if it were a performance. He stepped onto the stage amid applause, his tuxedo sharp, his smile practiced, his eyes full of arrogance. He swirled a champagne glass and looked over the ballroom with triumph. "Many of you here know," Harold began, "that the Hart family has always maintained high standards of honor and class." My heart sank. His voice dripped with poison. "And today," he continued, "I am proud that my daughter is entering a marriage we have carefully considered." I saw Nathan stiffen. Alyssa glanced at her father, confused, but Harold kept going, his tone as sharp as a blade. "To be honest," Harold said, lifting his glass and locking eyes with me as if issuing a challenge, "our family has standards, and Nathan, my new son-in-law, may not fully meet those standards yet." The ballroom fell silent. A few people gave polite, awkward laughs. My hand trembled once again. "Nathan," he said, "you're a good young man. I acknowledge that. But my daughter marrying you is a downgrade." I heard several people around me gasp sharply. Shannon, the bridesmaid, brought her hand to her mouth. Nathan looked as if someone had slapped him across the face. His expression drained, and his lips trembled. I saw his shoulders pull inward, like a child being scolded in front of a classroom. Alyssa turned toward her father, ready to protest, but Harold raised his hand as if forbidding her to say a single word. I felt the blood rush to my face, not because he insulted me, I was used to that, but because he humiliated my son on the most important day of his life. And I knew the time had come. I stood up. No one had time to react. I walked quickly toward the stage, the sound of my heels crisp against the wooden floor, each step pushing me closer to a moment I could never undo. Harold saw me and widened his eyes. "What are you doing?" I yanked the microphone from his hand as the room fell into stunned silence. A few whispers rose. Some people stood halfway from their chairs as if anticipating a scene no one dared imagine. I took a deep breath, and I began. "I'm sorry for interrupting," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding like a drum. "But if Mr. Hart has spoken honestly, then I believe it's time for me to do the same." Harold moved toward me to snatch the microphone back, but the sound technician had already muted his mic. That set him off. He barked, "Turn her mic off! Turn it off!" But no one moved, maybe because they didn't understand what was happening. Or maybe they wanted to see. I reached down to the small handbag sitting on the floor near the stage. I opened it and pulled out the thickest envelope, still sealed with my mark. "I have something here," I said. "A wedding gift for everyone, especially for my son, my future daughter-in-law, and Mrs. Sharon Hart." That name made Sharon lift her head. Even from a distance, I saw her go pale, as though she sensed disaster approaching. I opened the envelope. Inside were the photos Caleb had taken. I held one up toward the projector. "This," I said clearly, "is Harold Hart and his second family." The room erupted with noise. I pressed the remote the technician had slipped into my hand earlier, proof they had been prepared for this moment. The giant screen behind the stage lit up. Photo 1. Harold hugging a little girl with curly hair kissing her forehead. Photo 2. Him standing beside the young woman, his arm wrapped around her waist. Photo 3. The two children clutching his legs, mouths open as they called him Dad. A piercing scream broke out. It was Sharon. She collapsed onto her chair, hands trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Alyssa burst into tears, stumbling backward as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Nathan stood frozen, his gaze torn apart between pain and disbelief. Harold lunged toward the projector, his face blazing red, shouting, "Stop! Turn it off! Are you all insane?" But the technicians, two young men who had likely endured Harold's barking during the rehearsal, didn't move. One exhaled and whispered, "Sorry, Mr. Hart. This is a valid request." Harold roared, "Valid! This is my daughter's wedding. I continued, my voice steady and strong. "And here are the withdrawal records." The receipts appeared on the screen. Detailed transfers. The Shell Company account. Secret payments for Family M, the young woman's name. Then, the video of Harold meeting the woman in the parking lot, him bending down to lift the child, him glancing around nervously, him kissing the child's hair. The ballroom froze. No one laughed. No one breathed loudly. Everyone simply stared at Harold, at the truth, at the falling mask. Harold spiraled into panic. He rushed at me and ripped the microphone from my hand, but instead of speaking, he only opened his mouth silently. His lips trembled, his eyes bulged, his hair was disheveled, and his breathing came in ragged bursts. I could see the chaos inside him, the chaos of a man who knew he had been cornered. Harold stammered. I'm being framed. This is slander. But no one spoke in his defense. No one believed him. No one took his side. Alyssa sobbed and ran toward Nathan, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a whirlpool. Nathan, still shattered, held her out of instinct. Sharon collapsed onto the floor, her trembling hands gripping the table. A few people rushed to lift her, but her head kept shaking as if she couldn't accept the reality. The ballroom descended into chaos. Some people screamed. Some recorded on their phones. Some sprinted for the exits. Some stood frozen like stone statues. The clatter of falling glasses, scraping chairs, hurried footsteps, and sobs blended into a storm of sound, unlike anything I had heard at a celebration. But through it all, I stood still. Not because I was calm, but because I had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The moment truth sliced through Harold Hart's golden mask. The moment he couldn't hide behind money, power, or his voice. The moment everyone in the ballroom saw him exactly as he was. A liar, a hypocrite, and a cruel man. And finally, the moment I could look my son in the eye and say, "Do you see now, Nathan? This is the truth I wanted you to know." Harold left the stage like a man whose world had collapsed beneath him. He stumbled between tables, stepping on tablecloths and knocking over a flower vase nearly 3 feet tall. His shouts blended with Alyssa's cries, Sharon's frantic calls, and the murmurs of stunned guests, forming a chaos beyond description. I watched Harold burst through the ballroom doors. 2 security guards tried to stop him, but he shoved them aside and disappeared. Seconds later, I heard camera shutters clicking. Reporters were already waiting in the hallway, as if Harold's downfall had been destined. I stood on the stage, holding the muted microphone. I didn't regret anything, but my heart felt heavy, like a stone sat on it. Not because of Harold, but because of Nathan. When I turned around, I saw my son standing in the middle of the ballroom like a man lost in a blizzard. His face was drained, his lips trembled, and his eyes looked as if something he believed in for months had just died. "Mom." Nathan stepped toward me, his voice trembling. "Why did you do this? Why did you ruin my life?" It felt like someone had sucked the air out of my lungs. Some words, even without malice, cut like knives. This was one of them. I didn't answer immediately. I gently touched his hand, but he pulled away, a reflex that shattered my heart. "Nathan," I whispered, "I didn't ruin your life. I saved it." "That's a lie," Nathan shouted, a cry filled more with despair than anger. "You humiliated my family. You exposed everything in front of everyone. I can't bear this." "You can't bear it because you don't know everything yet." I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope with Nathan's name. "Read it. Read all of it before you blame me." Nathan stood frozen, hesitant to take it. But Alyssa, her face soaked with tears, stepped closer and touched his arm. "Nathan, you should read it." Her voice was so shaky it was almost a whisper. I looked at her. For the first time, her eyes held no trace of the overconfidence typical of the Hart family. Only fear, loss, and realization. Nathan took the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it and pulled out the pages. I watched his eyes shift from surprise to confusion to complete collapse. "Why?" His voice was so faint I had to lean in to hear. "Why did he use my name to withdraw the money?" I swallowed the bitter knot in my throat. Harold, eager to build the image of the wonderful father, had made Nathan sign a series of symbolic forms, which Nathan believed were nothing more than routine paperwork. But in Caleb's files, those signatures had been used by Harold to legitimize several suspicious expenses. "Nathan," I said as gently as possible, "he didn't ask for your signature because he trusted you. He needed you as cover." Nathan dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Alyssa knelt beside him. I didn't know anything. If I had known... I placed my hand on her shoulder, something I never imagined myself doing a few weeks ago. "You're a victim too, Alyssa," she cried harder. Meanwhile, Sharon was carried out of the room. but she hadn't lost consciousness. Her eyes remained open, watching me through her tears. When I approached, she reached out and gripped my hand. "Thank you," Sharon whispered. "Thank you for saving my children and me." Her voice was barely there, but the gratitude in it was heavy. I squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing, because no words could ease what she was going through. Reporters flooded into the ballroom. Headlines flashed on guests' phone screens. "Powerful businessman Harold Hart flees daughter's wedding." Leaked photos. Does Hart have a second family? Financial misconduct suspected at Hart & Sons. And I knew, in less than 24 hours, the entire city of Scottsdale would be talking about this. In less than 48 hours, all of Arizona would know. And in less than 72 hours, the Hart family would fall. Nathan stayed seated, silent like the shadow of himself. I sat beside him, not touching him, just close enough so he knew I was there. "Nathan," I said, "I know this is unbearable, but you must understand, I didn't do this to beat anyone. I did this so you wouldn't get pulled into Harold's crimes." "He used me," Nathan said, his voice cracked. "He wanted me to be his shield." I nodded. "Because you're the only decent person in that family." Nathan broke down crying, the quiet, painful cry of a grown man whose heart had cracked open. I pulled my son into my arms, letting him cry the way he once did when he fell off his bike in the front yard. "I have nothing left," he whispered. "That's not true." I held his face in my hands. "You have me, and you have the truth." Alyssa stood, wiping her tears. Her face was pale, but there was a new clarity in her eyes, the kind that only deep pain can create. "Mrs. Lane," she said, "I'm sorry. I thought you hated me. But now I understand you were trying to protect Nathan." I placed my hand on Alyssa's shoulder. "You were never the problem. The fault lies with the man who taught you how to see the world." Alyssa lowered her head. "I don't know what tomorrow will be like, but I do know this. Thank you for showing me the truth before it was too late." That night, the police went to Harold's house. They didn't arrest him, not yet, but they seized several documents. I knew because Caleb messaged me a little after 11 p.m. "The evidence you provided has reached the right people. The formal investigation has begun." The next morning, the news published. Harold Hart under investigation for financial fraud, embezzlement, forged records, and misuse of social project funds. By noon, 3 investors of Hart & Sons filed lawsuits. By late afternoon, a group of workers gathered in front of the company demanding their wages. And by the morning of the 3rd day, exactly 72 hours after the ruined wedding, the Hart & Sons headquarters building was officially sealed for investigation. The Hart family, once a symbol of Scottsdale's elite, became the center of the biggest scandal of the decade. Someone called me and asked if I felt satisfied. I simply answered, "No, I just feel relieved because the truth finally has its proper name." Nathan stayed at my house for 3 days straight, spending most of the time quietly lying in his room, holding on to his new reality. But each day he came out with less redness in his eyes and less trembling in his shoulders. Alyssa texted. Sharon sent her thanks. Many guests from the wedding called to apologize for laughing along with Harold. But to me, none of that mattered. The most important thing was that my son had escaped a path that would have dragged him into a bottomless pit. And I had kept my promise, a promise only a mother could fully understand. I will save you, even if I have to stand against the whole world. 3 days after the storm named Harold Hart, Nathan shut the door to the room in my house and only came out when he needed water. I didn't knock, didn't push, didn't question him. I had been a mother for more than 40 years, and I knew some pain must break on its own and mend on its own. No one else can touch it. But on the morning of the 4th day, while I was slicing apples in the kitchen, I heard hurried footsteps. I turned around and Nathan ran in and hugged me tightly, so tightly that I had to set the knife down and steady myself by holding his shoulders. "Mom?" His voice cracked right into my chest. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." I felt his whole body tremble, not from cold, but because he had finally let all his defenses fall. I placed my hand on his cheek, stroking it the way I used to when he was little, then pulled him into my arms. "You don't need to apologize," I whispered. "You just need to come back to yourself." Nathan stepped back slightly and wiped his tears with his sleeve. His eyes, for the first time in days, held a bit of light again. "I got swept up in their glamour, Mom. I kept thinking, that was the dream. That was the success I wanted to build." He paused for a moment, then sighed, as if he had just confessed the hardest truth. "But really, I felt like they were trying to reshape me to fit into their mold." I held his hand tightly. "You weren't wrong for loving. You were only wrong if you thought you had to lose yourself to be loved." Nathan bowed his head and slowly nodded. The next day, I received a message from Alyssa. Not long, not dramatic. "Mrs. Lane, if you don't mind, I'd like to meet you this afternoon." I agreed. We met at a small cafe on a corner of Camelback Road, where sunlight streamed through the windows, laying warm golden strips across the wooden tables. Alyssa arrived in a beige knit coat, her hair tied neatly, her face pale but without the arrogance she once carried. She sat across from me, her fingers intertwined, her gaze lowered as if she didn't yet have the courage to look at me directly. "How is your mother?" I asked. "My mom is still shocked," Alyssa answered, "but she's stronger than I thought." She said, "Maybe this is the best thing that's ever happened to me." I gave a small smile. Sharon, the woman who had always bowed under Harold's shadow, had finally stepped out of the invisible cage he built around her. Alyssa continued, "I'm sorry for ever thinking you disliked me. I didn't understand anything. I thought you just judged my family for not being good enough for Nathan." "Alyssa," I placed my hand over hers, "you were never the one I disliked. What I disliked was the lying." Alyssa nodded slightly, her eyes reddening. "I'm looking for a job now, any job. I don't want to live off my dad's money anymore, and I know things will be hard." "Hard is the right path," I said, "but you won't walk it alone." She looked up at me, startled. "Why would you help me after everything?" I smiled, the smile of a mother who has lived long enough to understand people. "Because you were deceived too. Because you also lost something. And most importantly, because you love Nathan, not the Hart name." Alyssa lowered her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. That evening, I told Nathan, not to pressure him into any decision with Alyssa, but so he could understand that truth always has more sides than the pain he was carrying. Nathan sat on the sofa, his fingers interlocked, thinking for a long time. "I still love Alyssa," he said slowly, "but I'm afraid going back now would throw us right back into the same cycle." I nodded. "You're right. Both of you need time. I want to start over, not as husband and wife, but as two people trying to heal." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already more mature than you were before, Nathan." The following weeks passed with a completely new rhythm, a rhythm I never thought I would experience at my age. Nathan woke up earlier, took walks around the neighborhood each morning. When he got back, he often helped me in the kitchen making coffee or preparing a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and fruit. Alyssa moved in with her mother. They rented a small apartment just enough for 2 bedrooms. Not luxurious, but peaceful and far brighter than the shadowed mansion Harold once ruled. She texted me every week, telling me about the job she found at a local clothing shop. Not fancy, but work she earned with her own hands. One afternoon, Alyssa came to my house to bring over some paperwork Nathan had left behind long ago. When I opened the door, she stood there with a soft smile, her face no longer wearing fear. "I want to help you cook dinner." She said it timidly but with determination, like a family. I looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, I didn't see her as an extension of the Hart family. I saw her simply as herself. "All right," I said. "I could use an extra pair of hands." We washed vegetables, chopped onions, rinsed chicken, and talked about ordinary things women talk about while cooking. Rising grocery prices, a windy morning, stories of how Nathan was afraid of the dark when he was little. Nathan came home while we were making chicken soup. When he saw Alyssa in the kitchen, he paused. Not the kind of pause that comes from pain. The kind that comes from realizing hope might still exist. "Hey," Nathan said softly. "Hi," Alyssa replied, her hand slightly trembling but her eyes no longer avoiding his. I stood to the side, pretending to fuss with the pot, but my heart warmed. Not because they might get back together. I didn't know and didn't want to force it, but because I saw 2 young people learning how to rise from the wreckage. In late-night conversations, Nathan spoke more about the feeling of being manipulated. He didn't say it with self-blame. He spoke like someone looking directly at a wound so it could finally heal. "I thought I was strong," he said, "but I didn't understand that all I wanted was to feel valued, and Harold knew that." "Knowing you were once weak isn't shameful," I said. "What matters is you stood up." Nathan leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. "Mom, without you, I think I would have lost everything." I placed my hand over his. "No, you only lost what you never truly had." One evening near the end of summer, the 3 of us, me, Nathan, and Alyssa, sat down to dinner together. No commitments, no promises, no pressure. Just a simple meal among 3 people trying to heal. I looked at them and realized, family isn't always made of marriage certificates or grand ceremonies. Sometimes family is simply the people who choose to sit together after the storm, even when they're still scared, still hurting, but they choose to stay. I knew the road ahead would be uneven. What happened to Harold the court would handle. What happened to Hart and Sons the investors would pursue. What happened to Nathan and Alyssa, time would decide. But I also knew this: justice sometimes comes at a painful cost, but it is a cost worth paying so the people you love can live truthfully. I stood up to clear the table, watching the 2 young people exchange small conversations, and my heart softened. I had fought. I had lost sleep. I had endured being misunderstood. But in the end, I saved my son. And I found peace again in this home. A peace not perfect, but true. A new beginning. Slow, humble, but full of hope. I always believed that time doesn't heal everything, but it reveals everything. For Harold Hart, that happened faster than anyone expected. Less than 2 months after the ruined wedding, the official trial began. The news spread across Arizona, showing Harold entering the courthouse in a wrinkled suit, his hair unkempt, his face worn as if he had aged 10 years. I didn't want to watch the whole trial. I already knew exactly what would be presented. As prosecutors listed the charges, I felt like I was hearing Caleb's notes read aloud, one by one, embezzling community project funds, creating fake material records, financial fraud, falsifying data, using someone else's identity for unlawful withdrawals. Each accusation sounded like another nail in the coffin of the reputation Harold had built with a polished facade for decades. I looked around the courtroom. Many who once applauded Harold at public events now stared at the floor, unable to look up. Sharon didn't come. Alyssa didn't either. Nathan chose to stay home. Those Harold once threatened, workers, subcontractors, came in large numbers. They wanted to witness the moment the law finally called the truth by its name. Harold sat at the defendant's table, hands clenched together. It was the first time I'd seen him without his usual sense of authority. No sharpness in his eyes, no confident smile, no gold ring he loved to flaunt at gatherings. All that remained was a man being swallowed by the life he created. When the judge read the sentence, I saw Harold lean slightly forward, as if needing something to hold on to so he wouldn't collapse. Defendant Harold Hart is hereby sentenced, with total penalties and custodial time as prescribed by law. The sound of the gavel echoed like a bell closing an era built on lies. Reporters shot up from their seats. Cameras flashed nonstop. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I only felt a heavy sadness. Some people dig their own graves with greed, but the saddest part isn't watching them fall. It's seeing the innocent get pulled down with them. A few days later, the prison clerk called me. "Mrs. Lane, Mrs. Hart. Oh, I mean, Mrs. Lane, the inmate Harold Hart is requesting to meet you." I hesitated. Since the wedding, I never imagined seeing him again. But I also knew nothing truly ends until the last questions are spoken. "I'll come," I said, "but I won't stay long." That afternoon, the Scottsdale wind was strong. I walked into the visitation room, surrounded by cold gray walls, the dim yellow lights making everything look tired and faded. When Harold was brought in, I went silent for a few seconds. The man in front of me was no longer the Harold Hart I once knew. The man who walked with elite confidence, wore watches worth thousands, and held his head high as if the world was beneath his feet. He wore an orange prison uniform and his hands still trembled slightly. When he saw me, Harold paused and lowered his head. Something I never thought I would witness. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "Thank you for coming." I sat down and placed my handbag beside me. "I only have 15 minutes. Harold gave a faint, sad smile. "I won't keep you long." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once signed countless contracts and directed hundreds of employees, now trembling, frail like those of a sick old man. "Why did you do it?" he asked. No accusation, no anger, just the confusion of someone who no longer had anything to hold on to. I looked at him and answered slowly. "I didn't destroy you, Harold. I only brought the truth to light. You destroyed yourself." Harold closed his eyes for a long moment. His shoulders shook, the first time I had ever seen him cry. Not loud, not like the outburst at the wedding, just slow tears falling, heavy like drops of late regret. "I was too arrogant," he whispered. "I thought I could control everything. I thought reputation was everything." "And you lost everything to protect that," I replied softly. Harold nodded, lifting a hand to cover his face. "I lost 2 children, lost Sharon, lost Alyssa, and the second family, Hart and Sons. Everything." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "But what hurts the most is that I lost myself." I said nothing. Neither of us needed to add more blame. Life had spoken on our behalf. After a long while, he looked up at me, his eyes swollen and red. "Do you hate me?" I shook my head. "I don't hate you, Harold. I'm only sad that greed turned you into someone you were never meant to become." He let out a crooked smile, then said, "If I hadn't met you that day, maybe I never would have been exposed." "I'm not the problem," I answered. "The problem is you lived too long on a lie." Harold nodded, as if he finally accepted what the rest of the world had realized long before him. When the prison officer stepped in to announce that time was up, Harold tried to speak quickly. "Mrs. Lane, if you ever see Nathan and Alyssa, tell them I'm sorry." I stood up and picked up my handbag. "I'll tell them," I said, "but whether they forgive you, that's their choice." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the ruin Harold had caused himself one more time. That was the last time in my life I ever saw him. When I stepped out of the prison building, the evening wind blew hard. The sky was strangely clear, as if the storm named Harold Hart had finally blown out of my life and out of the lives of those I loved. I stood on the steps and took a long breath. Not a breath of victory, but a breath of closure. A chapter had ended, a lesson had been completed, and justice, even painful justice, had finally been carried out. I walked toward the parking lot, the late afternoon sunlight warming my shoulders like a reminder. Truth always arrives, late or painful, but it comes to free the people who need to be freed, and I knew I had done the right thing. A year after Harold was sentenced, our lives had shifted into a different rhythm. Slower, steadier, and peaceful in a way I never believed I could have again. Scottsdale was still sunny, still full of desert winds in the evenings, but inside my small family, a new season had begun. Nathan and Alyssa decided to have a new wedding, not to compensate for the collapse of the first one, but to mark a true beginning, one not built on status, money, or empty praise. They chose a small church on the outskirts of town with light brown wooden beams and stained glass windows. It was the place where, the previous fall, Alyssa had spent hours sitting in silence, searching for her peace. This wedding didn't have 200 guests, no champagne poured into imported crystal, no arrogant smile from Harold, no judgmental glances from relatives, no whispers from people who only came to see who was richer. They invited only the people who truly mattered, those who stood by them during the hardest times, a few old friends of Nathan's, Alyssa's new co-workers, and the neighbors who supported me from the beginning. I stood inside the church, a light shawl across my shoulders, watching my son walk toward the altar. Nathan wore a simple navy suit, not expensive tailoring, but his eyes shone brighter than any gemstone. Alyssa followed behind, her white dress gentle as the breeze, her smile trembling yet innocent. No boasting, no insults, no looks of judgment, only love, pure and full. When they exchanged vows again, I felt each word sink deep into my heart. The first time they vowed before a world built on pretenses. This time, they vowed before their true selves. I stood nearby, quietly tearing up. For the first time in more than 2 years, I felt I had truly done the right thing. Right from the beginning, right in the deepest sense, right in a way that freed my heart. After the ceremony, we held a small outdoor reception behind the church. Just a few wooden tables, wild flowers in glass jars, a homemade wedding cake. Not grand, but beautiful in a way only sincerity can be. Alyssa held my hand and whispered, "Mrs. Lane, without you, I don't think I ever could have escaped that life." I gently patted the back of her hand. "No, you freed yourself. I only opened a door. You walked through it." Nathan came over and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Mom," he said, "I used to blame you, but now I'm proud to have a mother as brave as you." I laughed and tapped his arm lightly. "I'm not brave. I'm just a mother who knew her son deserved to live truthfully." Nathan pulled me into a hug, so different from the heavy hug after the storm first passed. This one was a hug of peace, of unconditional love. After the wedding, the three of us gradually settled into a new rhythm. Nathan joined a small but reputable construction company where he was valued for his real abilities. No more tense elite dinners, no more keeping up appearances to please anyone. Alyssa stayed with the job she found at the clothing store. They weren't wealthy, but she had a freedom she had never experienced before. Many evenings we ate together in my little kitchen. Alyssa shared stories about difficult customers. Nathan shared stories about funny coworkers. I listened, sometimes adding old memories, and my heart felt lighter. The things I had always wished for, honesty, peace, love without pretense, finally existed right in front of me. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Nathan suddenly said, "Mom, I think I finally understand what you always taught me. The truth, no matter how harsh, is what frees people." I looked at my son for a long moment. As long as you understand that, it's enough. "And I know," Nathan continued, "the real value of a person isn't something anyone can trample on unless we allow it." I held his hand. Exactly. No one can take away your worth, not even those who once thought they had the right. Alyssa placed her hand on top of ours and smiled softly. We all learned that in the hardest way. Over the past year, I saw many. People come and go from my life. Some came only to stand with me during a few stormy weeks. Some stayed and became new family. But no matter what, I realized something simple. When you live truthfully, when you refuse to bow to lies, the people who deserve you will find their way to you. I've lived most of my life already, but because of everything that happened, I feel like I just learned a new lesson. One that some people never fully understand. Peace doesn't fall from the sky. It's something you choose. You choose truth. You choose kindness. You choose to stand with what's right. And when you dare to choose, peace will come. As I share this story, I know one thing. You, the person reading or listening, have also faced unfairness at some point. Maybe not from a wealthy in-law family, but from people you loved who didn't understand your worth. If you've ever been looked down on, if you've ever been humiliated, if you've ever been pushed into the shadows because you didn't fit someone else's mold, then remember, your true worth cannot be taken. People can only make you forget it for a while. And once you reclaim it, as I reclaimed it for my son, you enter a whole new chapter of life, a chapter of peace, a chapter of truth, a chapter of your own. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Thank you for giving your time, your heart, and your understanding to this journey. The journey of a mother, a woman growing older but never giving up. And if you are still here, reading these lines, I hope you will stay with me for the next stories I share. Where are you from? Have you ever faced a moment when you had to stand up and protect your own worth? Leave a comment. I would love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe so I can continue sharing real-life stories. Stories of ours, of people who may no longer be young, but still have so much to say. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. You should go home. My son said it right there on the wedding dance floor while I was still holding a glass of champagne I hadn't even set down yet. Not whispered, not softened, not apologized for. Just 4 words, enough to push me out of the room where I had paid for every flower, every song, every forced smile that day. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She didn't say a word, just smiled, a very slight smile. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a wedding. This was an erasure. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I stood frozen for a few seconds, as if someone had pulled all the air out of my lungs. The music kept playing behind me, a soft jazz tune from the live band, the trumpet weaving through the cheerful chatter of hundreds of guests. Silk dresses brushed across the polished wooden floor. Glasses clinked together, bright and celebratory. No one noticed me. No one knew that, in that exact moment, I had just been pushed out of my own son's life. My name is Judith Monroe, 63 years old, a widowed mother who has spent more than half her life in Colorado in an old log house sitting on land my family has protected for 3 generations. I used to think I was a strong woman. I believed there was nothing left that could break me. After my husband died 12 years ago, after endless overnight hospital shifts, after crying while paying my son's college tuition bills. But I was wrong. Ethan's wedding, my only son, was held at a luxury resort in Napa Valley, more than 8 hours' drive from my home. Claire said she had always dreamed of a vineyard wedding, where the afternoon sun fell across long tables dressed in white linen, where everything looked like it came straight out of a lifestyle magazine. I nodded the moment Ethan asked if I could help cover some of the cost. In truth, it wasn't some. I paid most of it. I didn't tell anyone that to come up with that money, I drained nearly all of my retirement savings. I didn't say that I picked up extra night shifts at the hospital, even when my back hurt so badly I had to lean against the wall just to stand upright. I didn't say that I kept telling myself, this is the last time, the last gift for my son. A mother shouldn't keep score, right? At least that's what I believed. I arrived 2 hours early on the wedding day. The California weather was gently sunny, warm, the scent of ripe grapes drifting in the air. I wore a navy blue, knee-length dress, classic, understated, the exact style Claire had sent me months earlier with a short message, "Formal attire only." The dress cost nearly $400. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time that morning, wondering if I was trying too hard. Then I smiled at myself. The groom's mother should look the part, I thought. The ceremony was flawless. Claire walked down the aisle between rows of white chairs, her fitted lace gown, her blonde hair pinned neatly like a princess. Ethan stood at the end, shoulders straight, eyes bright. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I cried. I cried out of happiness, out of longing for my husband, who wasn't there to see this day, and out of a naive belief that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. After the ceremony, the reception began. I stood near the dessert table holding my champagne glass, watching Ethan laugh with his friends. I was waiting for a quiet moment to give him the envelope I had brought. Inside was a check I had signed the week before, my hand shaking so badly I had to sign it twice to keep the letters straight. I imagined hugging him, whispering how proud I was. That moment never came. Ethan walked toward me, his face tight. Not the stress of a busy groom, but the firmness of someone who had already made a decision and didn't intend to change it. When he said those words, "You should go home," I thought I must have misheard him. I gave a small, awkward smile, about to ask him to repeat himself, but his eyes left no room for doubt. "Claire is uncomfortable," he added, his voice lower but cold. "You're stressing her out." Around us, everything continued as normal. A middle-aged man tried to dance near the stage, making a few people laugh. A server bent down to straighten a tablecloth. No one looked our way, and maybe that was what hurt the most. I was being kicked out of my son's wedding, and the world didn't even pause for a breath. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to remind him that I hadn't said a single word to Claire all evening, that I had tried to turn myself into a shadow just to avoid bothering anyone. I wanted to scream that I was his mother, that I had paid for every detail in that room, but nothing came out. I looked at Claire. She was seated at the head table, one hand resting lightly on her wine glass, her lips curved into a small, very small smile. No one else would have noticed anything in it, but I did. I had lived long enough to recognize victory when it hid behind perfect politeness. I nodded. Just a very slight nod. I set my champagne glass down on the dessert table. The base touched the glass surface with a soft, sharp click. I turned, picked up my purse, and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't search for my son's eyes one last time. I was afraid that if I did, I would collapse right there. The path to the parking lot was long and bright with sun. My heels struck the stone in steady rhythm. Each step felt like a countdown. When the large doors closed behind me, the music and laughter were cut off abruptly. All that remained was silence and the distant sound of cicadas. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, forcing my shoulders not to shake. I had left many places in my life. Left the emergency room after overnight shifts, left the cemetery after my husband's funeral, left old rental houses when Ethan was young. But never had I felt erased like this. When I got into the car, my hands tightened around the steering wheel without thinking. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there looking back at the glowing resort in the late afternoon light. Inside, my son was raising a glass to his future, and I, the woman who had built the foundation for that future, was left on the outside, like an unnecessary detail. I started the car and drove away. The road out of the valley wound through endless rows of vineyards. The setting sun painted everything in soft shades of gold and orange. It should have been peaceful. But inside me, something was slowly freezing, not a burst of anger, but a cold, terrifying clarity. I began connecting the dots. Claire's subtle remarks in the months before, the way she always stepped in whenever Ethan and I tried to talk privately, the annoyed looks when I asked about his plans for the future, and then today, "You should go home." It wasn't an impulsive decision. Not wedding stress, not a small misunderstanding. It was the result of a process I had refused to see because I trusted motherhood too much. I drove for hours until the sky turned fully dark. With every mile, a thought took shape in my mind, slow but steady like tires rolling along the highway. If I could be erased from my son's wedding today, what would I be erased from tomorrow? The question echoed again and again like a warning, and I had no idea that only a few hours later that question would become real, in a way I could never have imagined. I drove that long stretch in a strange state, not crying, not shaking, not panicking, just a deep emptiness, as if someone had finally lifted a heavy stone I had carried on my chest for years, leaving my ribs exposed, aching, but also lighter in a strange way. The highway grew emptier. Long lines of yellow light stretched endlessly, like a chain of memories I had tried to neatly fold away throughout my years as a mother. And then, almost by instinct, I began thinking of Ethan from long ago, Not the man who had just asked me to leave his wedding, but the small boy who used to grip my hand tightly when our world fell apart. My husband died when Ethan was 11. It was a winter morning, snow still dusting the lawn in front of our house. Marcus, my husband, collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee, a fast, merciless heart attack that gave us no chance to say goodbye. I still remember the sound of the ceramic mug shattering on the tile floor, Ethan calling for his dad as he ran downstairs, and the heavy silence that followed, the silence that told me nothing would ever be the same again. I became a single mother in the span of one morning. The years that followed blurred into a long stretch without pause. I worked as a nurse at a local hospital, first-day shifts only. But Marcus's life insurance wasn't enough to last, and the mortgage was still there. I took evening shifts, then nights. There were weeks when I worked 6 days straight, 12 hours a day, coming home after Ethan was asleep and leaving again while he was still groggy at the breakfast table. I missed so much. Parent-teacher meetings I attended in my scrubs, school performances where I stood at the back of the auditorium, afraid Ethan would see how exhausted I was. But I never missed the most important thing, being there. I was there when he was sick, when he was bullied at school, when his first real heartbreak left him crying in his room for an entire evening. I learned how to be both mother and father, even though I never believed I was good enough at either. I remember summer evenings when Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, books spread everywhere. I made tea to stay awake while he worked through math problems, brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes I was so tired the words on the page blurred, but I stayed, just so he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I remember all the times I said no to myself. No new clothes, no vacations, no renovations I wanted to make to the house. Everything went into Ethan's college fund. When his acceptance letter arrived, I held him and cried, not from pride, but from relief. I had done it, at least up to that point. When Ethan met Claire, he was 26. I first met her over dinner at our house. Claire was polite, proper, but there was an invisible distance I couldn't name. She spoke softly, her smile always measured. Never more, never less. I told myself it was just her personality. Not everyone is warm, and I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. I tried to keep myself on the edges of their lives. I didn't give opinions unless asked. I didn't show up unannounced. I didn't bring up the past. I thought that was respect. But there were small signs I chose to ignore. The way Claire hesitated when I entered a room. How she gripped Ethan's hand a little tighter whenever I asked about their plans. The short, polite, but distant replies, as if every conversation with me was an obligation to be completed. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy for my son. When Ethan asked if I could help pay for the wedding, I didn't hesitate. I thought it was an important milestone, something I should contribute to so he could start well. I didn't tell Ethan that the amount was far more than I had expected. I sat down with an old notebook and added everything up. I withdrew from savings. I took out a small loan from the local credit union. I sold my old car and bought a cheaper one. I cut back on things that seemed small. No eating out, no new books, no weekend coffee. I told myself I would make it up later, after the wedding, after things settled. Each time I transferred money to the event planners, Claire sent a short message. "Thank you, Judith." No emojis, no follow-up. I reread those words and told myself I was being too sensitive. A few weeks before the wedding, I began to feel unnecessary. The big decisions had already been made. I was informed, not consulted. When I made a very gentle comment about the location, only that it might be far for older relatives, Claire smiled and said, "We've already decided." Not harsh, but final. I swallowed the rest of my words. I kept soothing myself with a single sentence, repeated like a prayer. As long as my son is happy, that's enough. I said it to friends, to relatives, to myself. I believed motherhood meant stepping back when needed, letting go at the right time. I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, everything would be fine. The truth was, I didn't realize I was being pushed out, little by little. When the wedding day arrived, I thought all the small tensions would disappear, that it would be a day about love and family. I prepared myself to smile, to stand behind the scenes, to be the kind of mother I was supposed to be. Quiet, proud, undemanding. I never imagined I would be asked to leave. Now, driving through the darkness, I began to see every piece with new clarity. Details I once thought harmless arranged themselves into a picture so clear it made my skin go cold. I realized I had confused sacrifice with self-erasure. I believed love meant giving without conditions, but I had never asked, what happens when that giving is no longer valued? I didn't know then that the wedding was only the first step. But as my tires rolled steadily over the road and old memories settled into silence, a sense of unease began to grow, slow, heavy, impossible to shake. Something was coming, something bigger, colder, and deep down I understood that the price I had paid for that special day was not the final price yet. I kept driving through the night, letting the road pull me farther away from that glowing vineyard valley. My headlights swept across road signs, dark rows of trees standing still on either side of the highway. The dashboard clock crept closer to midnight. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing, the steady hiss of tires on dew-damp pavement. At times I felt like misplaced luggage on the wrong conveyor belt, pushed along, left behind, no one looking back. The feeling didn't explode into anger or spill into tears. It lingered, stubborn and dull, like a bruise beneath the skin. I thought about the moment Ethan spoke those words, about the way his eyes avoided mine, about Claire's barely there smile. It all replayed in my mind without sound or color, leaving only the cold shape of the truth. I stopped at a small roadside gas station to refuel. The convenience store glowed under fluorescent lights, smelling of burnt coffee and stale pastries. The young cashier smiled out of habit as I handed over my card, unaware that the woman standing in front of her had just been erased from a family she herself had built. I bought a bottle of water, took a small sip, then set it on the passenger seat. My throat was dry, but I wasn't thirsty. I just needed to pause long enough to prove to myself that I was still moving forward, that the wheels were still turning. When I pulled back onto the road, the air grew cooler. The highway gave way to narrower roads winding through pine forests. I recognized the familiar scent of the mountains, sap, damp earth, night air heavy with mist. That smell guided me home, faster than any road sign ever could. And then after the final bend, I saw the old wooden gate appear in my headlights. The house stood there, as it had for decades, unpretentious, unpolished. Just a 2-story log house with a sloped roof, a wide porch, and the warm yellow glow of the porch light I always left on when I traveled. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The silence here was different from the silence on the road. It wasn't empty. It was dense, deep, filled with memory. I stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under my heels. The cold air raised goosebumps on my skin, but I didn't rush inside. I stood there, looking at the house the way you look at someone you love after a long absence. Dark windows, the wooden porch swing creaking softly in the night breeze, everything familiar, painfully so. This wasn't just a house. This was where my grandfather stood every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. This was where my father hammered each plank of the barn out back, sweat dripping onto the ground in the heat of summer. And this was where Marcus and I carried Ethan home from the hospital, a tiny bundle wrapped in white, crying when the cold air touched his cheeks. This land, 40 acres, was the greatest emotional inheritance of my life, not because of its market value, though I knew it was worth a great deal, but because every inch carried the footsteps of people I loved. Every tall oak at the forest's edge was planted by my father when I was still a girl. Every wooden fence bore my grandfather's hammer marks. And this house. Marcus repaired the porch roof with his own hands in the final autumn before he passed. I opened the door and stepped inside. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I let myself stand in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the space. The smell of old wood, the soap I used to mop the floors, the faint warmth left behind from a long day. All of it wrapped around me like an invisible blanket. I set my bag down on the chair and hung my coat on the hook by the door. Every movement was slow, as if I were afraid of disturbing the fragile quiet that covered the house. I walked into the living room. The armchair Marcus used to sit in was by the window. The coffee table had an old scratch on the corner, where Ethan once dropped a toy car when he was little. On the mantel were photo frames faded by time. I didn't look closely, but I knew every picture there. I didn't need light to see them. I sat down in the armchair, my hand resting on the armrest worn smooth by years of use. In that moment, the memory of Marcus felt so vivid I could almost hear his voice, low, slow, always carrying a hint of a smile even when he talked about serious things. I clearly remembered the last night we sat here together, talking about the future. Ethan was already grown then, getting ready for college. Marcus worried that I would struggle on my own if he were gone. I brushed it off, told him he was thinking too much. "Judith," he said, his voice weak but firm. "No matter what happens, you have to hold on to this land. Don't let anyone turn it into something that can be bought and sold. It's our family." I nodded. Back then, I never imagined that promise would become so heavy. That night, I didn't cry. The tears felt stuck somewhere, refusing to fall. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening only to the steady ticking of the wall clock. Each tick sounded like a step backward in time, carrying me to the years when I still believed family was something nothing could shake. I made a cup of tea, but let it go cold on the table. I didn't feel like drinking it. I just needed something in my hands to remind myself that I was still here, in this house, on this land. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, creating a familiar whispering sound. Normally, that sound comforted me. Tonight, it made me feel smaller than ever. I stood up and stepped out onto the back porch. The night sky stretched wide, full of stars. Pale moonlight fell over the distant field, where wild grass swayed gently. I remembered summer evenings when Ethan ran barefoot across the lawn, laughing as Marcus chased after him. I remembered the sound of Mom calling out from far away, full of trust. Those memories didn't come to comfort me. They came to remind me that something had changed forever. A vague but unmistakable sense settled in my chest. What happened today wasn't the end. It felt like the first crack of thunder signaling a storm forming far offshore. The surface was still calm, the sky still clear, but the air had changed. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned the lights off again. I didn't want light. I wanted the house to stay like this, silent, waiting. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and lay down on the bed without pulling the covers up. The ceiling appeared dimly in the moonlight slipping through the curtains. I stared at it for a long time, letting my thoughts drift without clinging to any single one. Before slipping into a shallow, restless sleep, a thought slid into my mind, light but sharp as a blade. If my son could throw me out of his wedding, what else would he be willing to take from me? I didn't know the answer, but somewhere deep inside, I knew that the calm of that night was only a thin shell, and I was afraid, not of the dark, not of being alone, but because I was beginning to understand that the real storm was still ahead. I woke up just as the sky began to lighten. Sunlight, thin as a veil of mist, slipped through the curtains and fell onto the cold wooden floor. My body felt heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from a deep weariness inside, as if I had carried an invisible weight through the entire night. I sat up slowly, set my feet on the floor, and listened as the house woke up with me. The soft creak of wood, the wind slipping through the window frame, the first birds calling from the distant pine trees. Everything looked normal, suspiciously normal. I made coffee, a habit I never broke. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. I leaned against the counter, mug in hand, and looked out the back window. Dew still clung to the grass. The old wooden barn stood quiet in the distance. There was no sign that the day before I had been pushed out of my son's wedding, as if it had all been a bad dream washed away by morning light. My phone vibrated just as I set the mug down. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I thought, naively, that he was calling to apologize, that he had reconsidered after his wedding night, that he realized what he had done was wrong. My heart skipped, not because of grand hope, but because of the old reflex of a mother always ready to forgive. I answered. "Hi, Mom," Ethan said, his voice so normal it stopped me short. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no trace of the emotions I had carried all night. "Did you make it home safely?" I was silent for a second. "Yes," I said. My voice was dry but steady. "I'm home." "Good," he continued, as if checking something off a list. "Hey, Mom, do you have a minute to talk?" I looked out the window again, where sunlight had begun to touch the trunk of the old oak tree. "I'm listening." There was a very brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his tone turning strangely upbeat, like when he was little and about to share a new idea. "Claire and I talked last night. We think it's time to talk about the land." I frowned but said nothing. "The land paperwork," Ethan went on a bit faster, as if afraid I might interrupt. "Can you send me a copy? Or better yet, the original? I need to look it over." It felt like someone had just dumped a bucket of cold water over my head. The paperwork. "For the land?" I repeated, not to question him, but to give myself time to understand what he had just said. "Yeah," he replied casually. "Our land. The 40 acres. I figured you knew what I meant." I leaned back against the counter, my hand gripping the edge of the marble. Part of me still couldn't believe this conversation was happening. Less than 12 hours after I'd been told to leave his wedding, my son was calling to ask about property documents. "What for?" I asked. My voice was low and even, unfamiliar even to me. Ethan let out a small, relieved breath, as if we had finally reached the important part. "Well, to talk plans. You know, leaving land unused is a waste. Claire and I think we could develop it." "Develop it?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said, growing more animated. "Build a few houses, maybe divide it into lots. Sell them. The market is really good right now, Mom. People are willing to pay a lot for land like that, especially near forest and mountains." I closed my eyes. The image of the old barn, the crooked fence, the oak trees my father planted appeared so clearly it hurt. "Ethan," I said slowly, "you're talking about our family land." "I know," he replied, still calm. "But look at it, Mom. It's too much for one person. Maintenance is exhausting, and you're not young anymore." That sentence, "you're not young anymore," landed like a clean cut, not cruel, not angry, just a truth spoken too easily. "Claire and her family know some people in construction," Ethan continued. "Her dad has a friend in real estate. Her uncle did a similar project in Arizona. We've already talked it through a bit. If we move fast, we could split the land, build vacation-style homes, and sell them in a few years." I opened my eyes. The familiar kitchen suddenly felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's house. "So, you've already planned everything?" "Not exactly," Ethan said quickly, correcting himself. "Just preliminary talk, to see what you think." I gave a soft laugh, empty of humor. "Are you asking me, or informing me?" There was a brief silence. Then Ethan said, his voice lower, more practical, "Mom, I just want what's best for everyone. This is a big opportunity. If it sells, you'll have money to live more comfortably. You could move somewhere smaller, easier to manage." I pictured myself in a senior living community, trimming artificial grass, playing bingo on Wednesday afternoons. I pictured this land leveled, the oak trees cut down, the barn dismantled, all of it wrapped up in 2 words: big opportunity. "What does Claire think?" I asked, even though I already knew. "She's very supportive," Ethan answered immediately. "Her family, too. Everyone thinks this is the logical move." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. The final pieces fell into place. The lavish wedding, my quiet removal, this morning's call. Nothing was scattered anymore. It all lined up into one cold, straight line. "So," Ethan continued, his tone slightly pressing, "can you send the paperwork this week? So we can review the details." I took a deep breath. The morning air suddenly felt heavy. "Do you know," I asked slowly, "that your grandfather spent nearly his entire life holding on to that land?" "I know the history, Mom," Ethan replied, a hint of impatience creeping in. "But we have to live in the present. We can't cling to the past forever." That sentence ended all remaining doubt inside me. The wedding wasn't the destination. It was just a stepping stone, a stage dressed up, beautifully enough to hide the real goal behind it. And I, the mother, was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed so the plan could move forward smoothly. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out, the skin thin with age. These were the hands that had changed bandages, given injections, worked without rest. The hands that had held my son's hand when he was afraid. And now these same hands were being asked to give everything away. "Ethan," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me, "I need time." "Time?" he repeated. "How long?" "For now," I said. "I'll think about it." There was a light sigh on the other end. "Fine, but think fast. The market doesn't wait for anyone." I ended the call before he could say anything else. The kitchen fell silent again. The wall clock ticked steadily, reminding me that time kept moving, no matter what had just happened. I stood there for a long while, watching sunlight slowly fill the room, touch the table, the cabinets, the old photo near the door, the one of Marcus standing on this land, smiling gently, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder when he was still a boy. I realized then that a mother's love can be weighed and measured like any other asset. And that morning in my familiar kitchen, I understood that I hadn't just lost my place in my son's wedding. I had been placed on the scale, After that call, I didn't do anything right away. I didn't call Ethan back. I didn't text him. I just stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the wall clock keep counting seconds as it had for decades. Then I put on my jacket and stepped outside. Mornings on this land always had a beauty of their own. Sunlight cut through the pine trees at an angle, falling onto ground still damp with dew. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wild grass and sap. I walked slowly along the familiar dirt path leading to the field behind the house. Each step felt like it was pulling me backward through time, returning me to days when everything here was tied to the voices of people long gone. My grandfather bought this land in the early 1950s. He had just returned from the war, carrying nothing but a small amount of money saved from years of hard labor. He chose this place because it was wild, because people thought no one would want to live on land so remote, rocky, and forested. But to him, it was a beginning. He built a small log house with his own hands, planted the first trees to mark the boundaries. He told my father, "Land won't betray you as long as you don't betray it." My father grew up here. He expanded the house, built the barn, put up fences. He planted oak trees along the small creek, believing that one day his grandchildren would sit beneath their shade. When I was a child, I thought this land was the whole world. I ran barefoot through the grass, scraped my knees, got bandaged by my father, then ran off again. Every scratch, every scar belonged to a specific corner of this land. They never disappeared, only faded with time. Marcus, my husband, fell in love with this land the first time he stepped onto it. He wasn't born here, but he chose to stay. He repaired the roof, reinforced the foundation, expanded the front porch. He planted fruit trees, saying Ethan would grow up alongside them. And when Ethan was born, this land witnessed my son's first steps, his laughter echoing across the fields. All of that. Those afternoons, those long winters, those sweltering summers couldn't be measured in money. They had no market price. No contract recorded them. But they existed, clearly and stubbornly, in every layer of soil, every piece of wood, every memory I carried. And yet, in that morning call, Ethan had called it unused land. I replayed those words in my mind one by one like a slow knife. Unused land. As if this place were nothing but an empty space waiting to be filled with concrete and profit. As if the years my family poured sweat, tears, and even blood into it had never existed. I walked up to the old wooden barn. Some of the boards were weathered, but the structure was still solid. My father used to say that if you build something carefully from the start, it can last longer than a lifetime. I placed my hand on the rough wooden wall, feeling each small crack beneath my fingertips. This wasn't unused land. This was living history. When I turned back toward the house, my phone vibrated again. Ethan. I hesitated, then answered. "Have you thought about it yet?" he asked immediately without easing in. "I'm standing on the land right now," I replied, my voice lower. "The land you called unused." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his voice carrying restrained irritation. "Don't make this complicated. I'm just talking realistically." "Your reality," I said. "The market's reality," he corrected. "Look at it, Mom. You're here alone. Maintenance costs money. The grass grows wild, the barn is old. Everything needs fixing. You could live more comfortably if you moved." "Moved where?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Claire found some really nice senior living communities," Ethan said, his voice softening in a forced way. "They have care services, activities, social events. You wouldn't have to worry so much anymore. It would be better for you." I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw myself packaged into a future someone else had designed. Neat, convenient, out of the way. An older woman who needed to be placed so she wouldn't interfere with younger people's plans. "How long have you been talking about this with Claire?" I asked. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. That silence was answer enough. "We're just thinking about the future," he said afterward. "Yours too." I let out a short laugh, this time without bitterness. It was low, brief, final. "You're thinking about your future," I said, "and I'm just an inconvenient variable." "That's not true," Ethan protested quickly. "You're reading into it. You always get too emotional." Emotional? The word hung between us like a verdict. I realized with painful clarity that in this conversation, I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be solved. "Ethan," I said slowly, deliberately, "do you know why your father wanted to keep this land?" "Because of feelings," Ethan replied, impatience in his voice. "I get it. But feelings don't pay bills." "But feelings gave you the foundation to stand where you are," I said. "Without this land, without the people who protected it before you, you wouldn't have the life you have now." "That's the past," Ethan cut in. "You keep clinging to it. You need to be more realistic." I took a deep breath. For the first time since my husband died, since I pushed myself to raise my son alone, I felt something with absolute clarity. I was being pushed out of my own family story. "I'm not sending the paperwork," I said. There was dead silence on the other end. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping. "I said no," I repeated. "This land is not for sale, not to be divided, not for you and your wife's family to profit from." Ethan's tone changed completely. No longer casual, no longer upbeat. It sharpened, tightened. "You don't have the right to be that selfish. I'm your son. This is my future, too." "You don't have the right to take something you don't respect," I replied. "So you're choosing the land over me?" Ethan almost shouted. The question hit me straight in the chest, but this time I didn't step back. "I'm choosing to keep my promise," I said, "and I'm choosing self-respect." Claire was right. Ethan snapped, his voice full of anger. "You've always been controlling. You always think you know what's best." I tightened my grip on the phone. "If controlling means not letting you destroy our family's legacy," I said, "then I accept that." The call ended in heavy silence. No goodbye, no farewell. I lowered my hand and stared at the screen as it went dark. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a truth that had just been laid bare. The conflict was no longer simmering. It had officially erupted. I stood there, between the house and the land I had protected my entire life. And for the first time, I understood that this fight was no longer just about property. It was about boundaries, about a mother who had sacrificed too much, finally standing up and saying no, even if the price was the very blood relationship she once believed nothing could ever break. The call ended, but its echo didn't fade. It hung in the house like a thin haze, seeping into every corner, making it impossible to pretend that everything would somehow settle on its own like before. I made lunch, that day in silence, ate a few bites out of obligation, then washed the dishes, my mind completely elsewhere. I knew it clearly. Ethan wasn't going to stop there. And I was right. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing. The first message came from Ethan, short, carrying the familiar tone he used whenever he wanted to soften me. "Mom, I'm sorry I lost my temper earlier. I'm just worried about you. Can we talk again?" I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message came in. You don't understand. Everything I'm doing is for our family's future. Then a missed call. Then 2. Then 3. I let the phone sit on the kitchen table, vibrating and going silent again, like a living thing trying to pull my attention. I thought about the times Ethan was little, crying for candy or toys, and how I learned that sometimes, if you didn't give in right away, the whining would pass. But this was no longer a child. This was a grown man, and what he wanted wasn't a toy. It was my entire life. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. You're making everything worse. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn. Claire is really upset. Her family doesn't understand you at all. A deep exhaustion settled over me. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from a person who has spent a lifetime trying to please others, only to be condemned for finally stopping. The call came around 9 p.m. This time, I answered. Judith, Ethan said, not calling me Mom, just my name. A small detail, but enough to tell me he had crossed into another territory. You're backing me into a corner. You backed yourself in, I replied, my voice so calm it surprised even me. No, Ethan shot back. You have all the power. You're holding the paperwork. You're holding the property. You're controlling everything. Controlling. That word again. That property isn't yours, I said. At least not yet. But I'm your son, Ethan nearly shouted. Who are you going to leave it to if not me? The question wasn't curiosity. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in reason. I could hear his breathing on the other end, fast and shallow, as if he were trying to convince himself he was right. Ethan, I said slowly, I've already told you. I'm not selling the land. There was a heavy pause. Then his voice shifted completely, dropping lower, colder. Then don't blame me, Ethan said, if things go too far. What do you mean? I asked. I'm just giving you a warning, he replied. The law won't always be on your side. I have my rights. I ended the call. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. But something inside me closed. That was the moment I realized emotion was no longer our shared language. It had been replaced by strategy. The next day, Claire called. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Part of me was curious what she would say. Another part of me was already familiar with that pleasant tone people use when they want something. Judith, Claire said gently, almost warmly. I just wanted to talk for a moment. Nothing tense. Go ahead, I replied. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she continued. Ethan and I respect you very much, truly, but you have to understand, we're building our own life. Respect? I repeated, unable to hide the edge in my voice. When exactly did you show me that respect? There was a very slight pause. Then Claire laughed softly, the sound carefully practiced. You're being overly sensitive. That wedding day? It was just stress. I never meant to push you out. But you did, I said, and you never apologized. I am apologizing now, Claire said quickly. I just hope we can talk like adults, calmly, rationally. Rationally, a very convenient word often used to cover coldness. What do you want? I asked plainly. I want you to look at the bigger picture, Claire said. That land, it's too much for you. I'm worried about your health, really. You can't live out there alone forever. The words sounded painfully familiar, exactly what Ethan had said, as if they had sat together and rehearsed every argument, every sentence. And if you were truly worried about me, I said, you wouldn't have started your marriage by pushing your mother-in-law out of the wedding. Claire's voice stiffened slightly, but only for a moment. Judith, I think you're putting emotions over reason. You're acting selfishly." Selfish. The word was spoken lightly, like a feather, but it landed like a stone. I suddenly understood that in this story the roles had completely reversed. I, the one who had given everything, was now the selfish one. And they, the ones demanding, saw themselves as victims. "You've said enough," I replied. "There's nothing left to discuss." "Judith." I hung up. In the days that followed, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. Messages came constantly, sometimes from Ethan, sometimes from Claire, sometimes from unknown numbers I guessed were relatives on Claire's side. The content circled the same points again and again. I was overreacting. I was controlling. I was ruining my son's future. Some nights I picked up my phone and reread the messages, wondering if I really was wrong. Was I clinging too tightly to a past that no longer fit? Was I making things difficult for my son because I was afraid of loss? But then I stepped outside, looked at the land stretching under the moonlight, and the answer became clear. I wasn't afraid of losing the land. I was afraid of losing myself. One morning, after waking up to more than a dozen missed calls, I did something I had never done before. I turned my phone off completely. No vibration, no notifications, no screen lighting up. The house became strangely quiet, as if I could finally breathe. I made tea, sat on the back porch, and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. For the first time in days, I didn't feel pulled in every direction by other people. In that quiet, I began to think, not about how to calm Ethan, but about what I wanted my future to look like. I had lived too long in the role of the one who sacrifices, the one who gives in, the one who steps back so others can move forward. But I wasn't young anymore. I didn't have time left to fix choices born out of fear. A very small, very faint thought began to take shape. I didn't name it. I didn't dare say it out loud, but it was there, like a seed planted in dry soil after the first rain. If they could make plans behind my back, then maybe I needed a plan of my own. I didn't know then how fast that seed would grow. I only knew that in the moment I chose silence and a temporary retreat, I wasn't running away. I was preparing. I kept my phone off for 2 full days, not to punish anyone, but because I needed to hear my own voice again. The familiar sounds of this land returned, the wind moving through the pines, the barn door creaking as the temperature shifted, my own footsteps on the worn path leading to the forest's edge. In that quiet, one thought grew clearer and clearer, no longer just a seed. If I did nothing, they would do it for me. Ethan and Claire weren't hiding their intentions anymore. They weren't speaking the language of emotion, but the language of plans, of profit, of what was reasonable. And what frightened me most wasn't that they wanted to sell the land. It was how they talked about it, as if this place were nothing more than an obstacle, a burden that needed to be removed so the road ahead could be clear. I had seen too many patients at the hospital lose control over their own lives simply because they were one step too slow. I had always believed that would never happen to me. But now, as my son began talking about rights and the law, I understood that I could no longer rely on motherhood to protect what mattered. On the 3rd morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up almost instantly, showing dozens of missed calls and unread messages. I didn't open them. I searched for one name in my contacts, Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca was the lawyer who had helped me handle the paperwork when Marcus died. She didn't talk much, didn't circle around issues, and always looked straight at the problem. I hadn't seen her in years, but as I pressed the call button, I knew this was the call I needed to make. "Sloan Law Office," a woman's voice answered. "This is Judith Monroe," I said. "I need to see Rebecca as soon as possible." There was a brief pause. Then Rebecca's voice came on the line. "Judith, it's been a long time. Are you all right?" "I need to talk," I said, "about the land." Her tone turned serious. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" I drove into town in the early afternoon. The familiar road past small shops, the old cafe, the post office where I used to take Ethan to mail letters to his grandparents when he was little. This town had witnessed every stage of my life, from a newly married young woman to a busy mother to a widow trying to stand her ground. And now I was coming back with a different kind of fear, heavier, because it came from my own blood. Rebecca's office was on the second floor of an old brick building. The wooden stairs creaked softly under my feet. When I stepped inside, I smelled paper, ink, and coffee. A very law office smell, very practical. Rebecca stood when she saw me, her brown hair streaked with gray pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "You look tired." I gave a faint smile. "I probably am." I told her everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. The wedding, the words, "You should go home," the call the next morning, the messages, the accusations of selfishness and control. I even told her about the suggestion to move me into a senior living community as a solution for everyone. As I spoke, Rebecca didn't interrupt. She just listened, occasionally jotting down short notes. When I finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Rebecca set her pen down and leaned back. "What's your biggest fear?" she asked. I didn't have to think long. "That they'll destroy the land," I said. "That everything my family built will disappear. That one day I'll be standing there watching bulldozers flatten the place where my grandfather planted trees, where my husband once stood smiling with our son." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then we need to make sure that never happens." She pulled a folder from her drawer and flipped through a few pages. "You're still the sole legal owner of the land. Ethan has no legal rights to it, unless you transfer it or you pass away without clear arrangements." "I know," I said, "but I don't want everything to depend on unless." Rebecca studied me for a moment as if weighing something. Then she said, "There is a way." She began explaining about a conservation trust, a type of trust designed for land. The property would be placed into the trust with very specific conditions. It could not be sold, could not be divided, could not be commercially developed. Its sole purpose would be preservation, for nature, for the community, for future generations. "The most important thing," Rebecca said, slowing her voice so I would hear every word, "is that once you do this, it can't be undone. Once the land is in the trust, it no longer belongs to you personally. You won't be able to take it back or change your mind." I fell silent. The thought tightened my chest. This land had belonged to my family for so many years. The idea that it would no longer be in my name, even for protection, made me hesitate. "How will Ethan react?" I asked. Rebecca was blunt. "He won't be happy, and you need to be prepared for strong opposition." I looked down at my hands, fingers that had trembled while signing so many documents over a lifetime, but never like this. "If I don't do it," I said softly, "I'll live in fear forever." Rebecca nodded. "That's right. And you also need to understand, doing this isn't revenge. It's setting boundaries." Boundaries. The word echoed in my mind like a belated reminder. I had lived my whole life without clearly drawing boundaries with my son. I thought love meant leaving the door wide open. I was wrong. Without boundaries, love gets invaded. I sat there for a long time, weighing everything. Ethan as a little boy, his hand wrapped in mine as we crossed the street. Marcus standing on the land, telling me I had to protect it at all costs. And Claire's faint smile when I was pushed out of the wedding. "I need time," I said. Rebecca didn't press me. "Of course, but you should know that time is also a factor. The pressure from them won't ease." I stood up, took my bag, and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, I turned back to Rebecca. "If I decide to do it," I asked, "will you help me?" She smiled. Not a comforting smile, but a steady one. "That's my job." On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove slowly, letting each thought settle. When I turned onto the dirt road leading back to the house, I stopped the car, got out, and looked around at the familiar land. The afternoon light fell low, tinting the grass gold. A light breeze carried the scent of pine resin. I placed my hand on the trunk of the oldest oak tree and felt the rough bark beneath my fingers. "I'll protect you," I whispered, not knowing whether I was speaking to the tree, to Marcus, or to myself. In that moment, the hesitation inside me began to fade. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I had done something more important. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where my boundary was, and I was ready to defend it. I didn't return to the law office the very next day. I needed one more night, not to hesitate, but to be sure this decision wasn't born from anger or hurt. I had lived long enough to know the difference between a reaction and a choice. Reactions are impulsive. Choices have to stand even after emotions settle. That night, I slept very little. I didn't toss and turn, and I didn't dream. I just lay still, listening to the house breathe. The wind tapped softly against the window frame. Tree branches brushed the porch roof. Those familiar sounds had been the backdrop of my life for decades, and now they seemed to be witnessing me reach a crossroads no one else could walk for me. The next morning, I made coffee, drank it slowly, then got dressed. Not anything formal or elaborate, just the light brown jacket I usually wore when going into town, the shoes that had been with me for years. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving. That face had wrinkles and weariness, but no longer confusion. I nodded to myself like a quiet confirmation. When I walked into Rebecca Sloane's office for the second time that week, she looked at me and immediately knew I was ready. There was no long small talk. Rebecca pulled a thick folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. Crisp white pages, black printed text, dry legal language. But I knew that inside was the fate of the land, and also of my relationship with my son. "Before we begin," Rebecca said slowly, "you need to hear this one more time. When you sign, the land will be transferred into a conservation trust. It will no longer be personal property. It won't belong to you, to Ethan, or to any heir." "I understand," I said. "You won't be able to change this decision later," she continued, "even if you want to." "I understand," I repeated, and this time my voice didn't shake. Rebecca studied me for a few seconds, then nodded. She slid the pen toward me. I took it. The pen felt heavier than I expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. I looked at the printed line at the top of the page. Judith Monroe, grantor, the one who transfers, the one who gives authority, the one who ends one chapter and begins another. I signed. Blue ink appeared on the paper, familiar yet strange. I signed the first page, then the second. Each time I put the pen down, it felt like I was loosening invisible cords that had bound me for years. There was pain, yes, a dull ache like pulling a tooth that had been loose for a long time. But right after came a spreading sense of relief, slow and steady. Rebecca turned the page. I signed again. Long, detailed, dry clauses. No selling, no subdivision, no commercial development, no transfer, no exceptions, no conditions. The land would be protected forever, not by emotion, but by law. On one page, in the middle of the file, there was a short paragraph that made me stop. The property shall be removed from the grantor's estate and shall not be subject to inheritance. The property would be removed from the will. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. This was the moment I understood very clearly. With this signature, I wasn't just protecting the land, I was also ending every hope Ethan had ever held, even the ones he never spoke aloud. I was closing the door my son believed would always be open to him, no matter what he did. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I thought of Ethan as a boy, standing on this grass, holding a wooden stick like a sword, declaring that one day he would protect our home. I thought of Marcus, his voice low and weak in his final days, his hand in mine as he said, "Don't let anyone take it away." I thought of my grandfather, of my father, men, who didn't leave me much money, but left me a foundation no one had the right to destroy. I opened my eyes. "Keep signing," I told myself. I signed the remaining pages slowly but firmly, no rushing, no hesitation. When I signed the final page, Rebecca placed her hand on the folder as if to confirm it was done. "It's finished," she said. "From this moment on, the land belongs to the Conservation Trust. It's protected by law." I set the pen down. A brief emptiness passed through me, not from loss, but from something ending. And right after it came a peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. "What do I do next?" I asked. "Nothing," Rebecca replied. "The rest is on me, but you should prepare yourself." "I am prepared," I said. On the drive home, I went slower than usual. I didn't turn on the radio. I let my thoughts drift freely without grabbing onto them. I knew that when Ethan found out, his reaction would be fierce. I knew Claire wouldn't stay quiet. I knew accusations, threats, pleading, all of it would come. But I also knew something else. I was no longer standing on unstable ground. When the car turned onto the dirt road leading home, I stopped once again, as I had been doing these past days. I stepped out and stood in the land, bathed in late afternoon light. The wind moved through the tall grass. In the distance, the old wooden barn still stood, quiet and enduring. I placed a hand on my chest and felt my steady heartbeat. "I did the right thing," I whispered, needing no one else to hear. In that moment, I felt the change inside me clearly. I was no longer the woman waiting for her child's approval, no longer the mother afraid that a firm decision would make her lose everything. I still loved Ethan. That hadn't changed. But I was no longer willing to trade myself to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. I went inside, hung up my jacket, and made tea. Those small, familiar tasks suddenly felt steadier, as if everything had found its proper order again. I sat down in Marcus's armchair and looked out the window. The light faded outside, leaving a calm, deep blue. The storm hadn't arrived yet. I knew that. But when it did, I wouldn't be standing in the open anymore. I had signed. And that signature, irrevocable, was exactly what kept me standing. I knew that call would come. I just didn't know it would come so quickly. The phone rang while I was standing on the back porch, watering the wildflower bed Marcus had planted years ago. The day was slipping toward evening, the sunlight softening, a light breeze making the petals tremble. The scene was so peaceful it was almost cruel, because I knew very well this peace was about to be torn apart. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the hose, set it neatly aside, wiped my hands on my pants, and only then picked up the phone. Not because I wanted to prolong the tension, but because I wanted to be truly ready. "Mom," Ethan said the moment I answered. His voice was no longer normal, no longer angry, but breaking in a different way. Please tell me this is all a misunderstanding." I leaned against the porch post and looked out at the land sinking into the colors of dusk. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though we both knew the answer. "Rebecca Sloan just called me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "She said you signed something. That the land doesn't belong to you anymore. Tell me, Mom. This isn't true, right?" I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice steady. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "I transferred the land into a conservation trust." On the other end of the line, silence crashed down, a thick silence so heavy I could hear my son's ragged breathing. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, you can't do that. You don't have the right." "It's my legal right," I replied, "and I did it." Ethan's voice broke completely. "Mom, you don't understand. You just destroyed everything, all our plans." "Plans you never once asked me about," I cut in, my voice still even. "Plans you thought you could carry out after throwing me out of your own wedding." I heard a strange sound in the background. Footsteps. A woman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, what's going on?" Claire's voice rang out, not quiet at all. "Who are you talking to?" "Mom," Ethan said quickly, as if afraid I'd disappear. "You have to fix this. I'm begging you. This is too big." "Put Claire on," I said. There was a brief hesitation. Then I heard the phone change hands. "Judith?" Claire spoke. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was sharp, tight, nearly shaking with anger. "I don't understand why you would do this." "You understand perfectly," I replied. "You just don't like it." "This is incredibly selfish," Claire said, each word heavy. "You're not thinking about Ethan. You're not thinking about our family." "I have thought about it," I said slowly. "I thought long and hard, and I chose to protect what my family built instead of letting it be destroyed for someone else's benefit." "Destroyed?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I call that development. I call that the future." "A future where I'm pushed aside," I said, "just like you did at the wedding." I heard a sharp breath on the other end. "Judith, you can't keep clinging to that," Claire said. "That's in the past." "It's in the past for you," I replied. "Not for me." Ethan grabbed the phone back. "Mom, I'm begging you," he said, his voice nearly collapsing. "You can change this decision. I know you can." "No," I said, just one word, clear. "I can't. I'll sue," Ethan blurted out. Immediately after, he seemed to regret it. I don't want to, but you're leaving me no choice." "You can try," I replied, "but you won't win." "I'm your son," Ethan almost shouted. "I have inheritance rights." "You don't have rights to something you don't respect," I said. "And Rebecca already explained that to you. The Conservation Trust is irreversible." On the other end, I heard Claire mutter a curse under her breath. "We'll find another lawyer," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "There has to be a way." I closed my eyes for a second. "You can ask as many lawyers as you want," I said when I opened them. "The truth doesn't change." "Mom," Ethan choked, "you're choosing the land over me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the land stretching out in front of me, the rows of trees standing still in the fading light. I remembered the moment Ethan looked at me at the wedding, his eyes distant and hard. I remembered the feeling of being told to leave, like an unwelcome guest. "You already chose, Ethan," I said at last. "You chose when you said you should go home. You chose when you called this land abandoned. You chose when you treated me like an obstacle." "I didn't think you'd go this far," Ethan said, his voice shattered. "I didn't think you'd dare." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think about me at all. You just assumed I would always give in." There was a long silence. This time, no one spoke. I could hear Ethan breathing heavily, hear Claire whispering angrily somewhere in the background. I knew that in this moment, everything in my son's mind was collapsing, not just his plans, but his image of the mother he believed would never say no. "Mom," Ethan said very softly, like he used to when he was little, "I'm scared." I tightened my grip on the phone. My heart ached, but it didn't waver. "You're scared because you lost control," I said, "and I've lived in fear for too long." "So this is really it?" Ethan asked. "That depends on you," I replied, "but this land is settled." I heard a quiet sob, then Claire snapped sharply, "Ethan, stop begging, she's not worth it." That sentence, more than any threat, made everything brutally clear. "I've heard enough," I said. "We'll talk later if there's anything left to talk about." I ended the call. My hand trembled slightly, but not from regret. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch and watched the last light of day fade. In my chest was a deep sadness, the sadness of a mother realizing the child she raised no longer stood on her side. But at the same time, another feeling rose, a cold clarity. What I had just done wasn't the cause of this collapse. It was only the result. Cause and effect were taking shape, and I knew that from this moment on, none of us could return to the original starting line. Time began to move, differently after that call, no longer frantic, no longer suffocating. Days followed one another slowly, as if the land itself were deliberately pulling me back into its natural rhythm. Summer passed, leaving cooler mornings and shorter afternoons. I worked in the garden, repaired the fence on the west side, repainted the barn door. Small, repetitive tasks, but each time I finished one, I felt like I was laying another brick in my new piece. Ethan stopped calling. Not immediately. In the first few weeks, emails still came, forwarded from his lawyer, written in stiff language filled with familiar threatening phrases. Reconsider, dispute, legal rights. Rebecca handled all of it. She replied briefly, precisely, and left no opening. Whenever I asked, she simply said, "There's no progress, they have no case." Then the emails became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped. News about Claire reached me in a way I never expected, through a neighbor who stopped by to help fix a water pipe. He mentioned it casually, like small-town talk. Claire had moved out of the apartment the newlyweds had rented, just a few months after the wedding. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to. Later, there was a short email from Rebecca with a simple note attached, "For your awareness." It was a notice of legal separation filed by Claire. No flowery language, no long explanations, just dry, cold text, exactly like the way she had looked at me on the wedding day. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, reading those few lines over and over, not because I was happy, not because I was sad. I just felt empty. The emptiness of someone who had seen what they knew all along, but still hoped it wouldn't happen. Ethan lost his marriage before it ever had a chance to become a family, and with it, he lost the illusion that everything in life could be traded for plans and pressure. The legal threats disappeared completely after the first lawsuit was dismissed. No grounds, no legal interest, nothing to hold on to. Rebecca told me the other lawyer had advised Ethan to stop because the longer it dragged on, the more money he would lose, and the worse it would look if there were ever any future disputes. "He's paying the price," Rebecca said during a call, "and not just financially." I knew what she meant. I heard that Ethan had to sell the new car he'd bought to pay off debts. I heard he moved into a smaller apartment. None of that came from me, and I didn't go looking for it. It arrived on its own, like the natural consequences of a chain of bad choices. As for me, life slowly became peaceful again, in a way I had forgotten was possible. I began attending community meetings connected to the Conservation Trust, not as someone in charge, but as a contributor. I listened to young people talk about environmental protection, about nature education. I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in my son's eyes for years: respect. The land began to change in very small, very real ways. A path was cleared so children could visit safely. One corner of the meadow was left untouched so wildflowers could keep blooming with the seasons. No concrete, no tall fences, just small wooden signs that read, "Conservation Area. Please tread lightly." The first time a group of children came to visit, I watched from a distance. They laughed, ran around, pointed when birds lifted from the edge of the woods. A young teacher explained the old oak tree to them, how it had been standing longer than their grandparents had been alive. I saw a little boy place his hand on the trunk, exactly the way Ethan used to when he was small. I turned away, not because it hurt, but because I understood. Life keeps going, even when it doesn't follow the shape we once imagined. In the evenings, I sat on the porch, drank tea, and watched the sun set behind the trees. No more constant phone calls, no more accusations, just insects, wind, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I no longer lived in fear that someone would come take something from me tomorrow. Legacy, I realized, was never about money. It is the ability to say enough when greed starts to blur family ties. It is protecting values that can't be converted into profit. It is the courage to accept the loss of a relationship so you don't lose yourself. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. Just one short line: "Mom, I'm sorry." No explanation, no request, no plan. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply right away. I needed time, and this time I knew I had the right to it. I looked out at the land bathing in the last light of day. The children were gone. Nature had returned to its own rhythm. Everything was quiet. The price of greed had been paid. And the true value of legacy, not something to seize, but something to protect, finally stood clear and undeniable. The letter arrived on a very ordinary morning. Not an email, not a text. A cream-colored paper envelope, slightly thick, placed neatly in the wooden mailbox by the gate. My name was handwritten on it in a familiar yet unfamiliar script, slanted slightly to the right, a bit shaky, as if the writer had paused many times before each word. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. I knew immediately it was from Ethan. I didn't need to see a return address. I didn't need any other sign. Some things, no matter how much time passes, a mother recognizes by a faint feeling deep in her chest. I brought the letter inside and set it on the kitchen table. Made tea, sat down. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, laying a thin stripe of light across the envelope. It was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I took a deep breath. Then I opened it. The paper inside was folded into thirds. Not expensive stationery, just ordinary letter paper, slightly wrinkled at the corners, as if it had been clenched and then smoothed out again. The first word tightened my chest. Mom. Just one word, but different from before. No demands, no blame, no pleading, just a raw, fragile address. Ethan wrote that he had lost many nights of sleep, that when everything collapsed, his marriage, his plans, the things he thought were certain, he finally began to look back at every step he had taken. He admitted that he had let others lead him, had let promises of an easy future blur the past. He wrote that Claire hadn't forced him with orders, but with carefully chosen words, that he believed it was maturity, a way of stepping out of his mother's shadow, that he hadn't realized that while trying to prove he was an independent man, he had betrayed the only person who had never turned her back on him. I read slowly, not skipping a single word. Ethan wrote about the wedding day, about the moment he saw me standing alone by the dessert table. He said he knew then that he was wrong, but he chose silence because he was afraid of upsetting his wife, afraid of damaging his image in front of others. He called it cowardice, his word, not mine. He wrote that when Claire left, he sat alone in the empty apartment and for the first time understood what it meant to be left behind. No one waiting for him to come home, no one asking if he had eaten, no one reminding him to wear an extra layer when it was cold. He wrote that in that moment he thought of me not as a controlling mother, but as a quiet presence he had always taken for granted. By then my hands were trembling. Ethan admitted that he had seen the land as an asset because he had never had to sweat to keep it. He wrote that he had confused the right to inherit with the right to take, that he hadn't understood that legacy is passed on with responsibility, not as an unconditional gift. Then came the part that made me stop. I've thought about everything over and over, and I realized something painful. The only person in my life who truly sacrificed, asked for nothing, never set conditions, was you. And you're the one I hurt the most. I folded the letter, not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because I couldn't. The tears came unexpectedly, not in a rush, not with sobs, just quiet drops falling onto the back of my hand, hot and heavy. It was the first time I had cried since the wedding, not from resentment, not from loss, but from something deeper. Because at last, my son had seen what I once feared he never would. I sat like that for a long time. The letter lay on the table. The tea had gone cold. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor. At the end of the letter, Ethan didn't ask for the land back. He didn't mention money. He didn't talk about plans. He only wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't expect forgiveness right away, that he only hoped that one day I might be able to look at him without pain. He signed his name, just his name, nothing else. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it into the desk drawer where I keep important papers, not to lock it away, but to let it be there, present, but not demanding. I wasn't ready to forgive, not because I didn't want to, but because forgiveness isn't a door that swings open just because an apology arrives at the right time. It's a long road, and I had gone too far down the path of protecting myself to return to the starting line immediately. That afternoon, I walked the land, a light breeze, clear sky. I stood beneath the old oak and placed my hand on its trunk, as I had done so many times before. I thought of Ethan as a child, of Marcus, of all the versions of myself who had passed through this place. I didn't know what the future would hold. Maybe one day I would answer the letter. Maybe I would invite Ethan here, not as an heir, but as a son, if he was patient enough to learn how to stand beside me again instead of across from me. Or maybe we would keep our distance, a distance not born of hatred but of healing. I didn't rush to decide. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself not to be the one who fixed everything right away. I allowed the future to remain open, not shaped by anyone else's wishes, but by a rhythm I could live with. The letter rested quietly in the drawer, and I, at last, allowed myself to breathe more slowly. My life after that wasn't dramatic, the way people often imagine when a family breaks apart like that. It was quiet, steady, and stronger than I ever expected. I woke each morning with sunlight filling the room. I made coffee, opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and took a deep breath of grass and damp earth. The land was still there, unchanged, needing no explanation. The oak still stood, the path still guided my steps along familiar rhythms. No one came to take anything away. No machines, no billboards, just the quiet continuation of nature and memory. I grew used to this peace, not the peace that comes when every relationship is perfect, but the peace that comes when you stop betraying yourself to hold on to things that are no longer love. I no longer jumped every time the phone rang. I no longer lived in fear that one firm decision would cost me everything. I had lost something, but I had kept something more important. The land now belongs to the Conservation Trust. Children come to learn about nature. Young people plant more trees, repair the paths, place small wooden signs that tell the history of this place. I am not the center of it all, and I don't need to be. I am simply part of the flow, just as my grandfather was, just as my father was, just as Marcus was. I came to understand that true legacy isn't about how much money you leave behind or who gets called an heir. Legacy is about what you choose to protect when you have the power to choose. It's about the values you refuse to sell, even when the price offered is tempting. And sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you give your children, but the lesson you force them to learn, even if it comes late. I still love Ethan. That didn't disappear just because he hurt me, but I no longer confuse love with unconditional sacrifice. I once believed that being a mother meant yielding until the end, staying silent to keep the peace, enduring so your child could be comfortable. I was wrong. Love does not mean letting others trample your boundaries, and protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most honest form of love toward yourself and toward others. Some afternoons I sit beneath the old oak and watch sunlight filter through the leaves. I think about everyone who has passed through my life, the choices that brought me here. I no longer ask, what if? I don't wish to go back to any moment to change it. I walked my path, slow, painful, but right. If there is one thing I want to say to anyone listening to this story, it is this. You are not too old to set boundaries. You are not too late to choose yourself again, and you do not owe anyone a sacrifice that costs you your own worth. My life now is not grand, but it is real. It stands firm, and it belongs to me. If you're listening to this story, I would love to know, where are you watching from? From which city, or from what quiet corner of the world? Was there something in this story that felt like it was about you? If you were in my place, what would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every line with gratitude. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening to my story with patience and empathy. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so we can continue listening together to more stories about family, about boundaries, and about values that cannot be sold. I know that somewhere out there are people who are also learning how to stand upright again. And if this story helps you feel a little steadier, then everything I went through truly meant something.